The air is still. Not the stillness of a calm evening or a quiet morning before the birds wake. This is a deeper stillness. An older one. The kind that has no memory of sound at all. You are standing on a plain of red rock that stretches in every direction until it meets a sky so wide and so pale it looks almost white. There is no horizon the way you know horizons. No line of trees, no distant hills softened by haze, no silhouette of anything that has ever moved of its own choosing. Just red earth and white sky and the hot dry smell of stone that has not seen rain in longer than you can calculate. The ground beneath your feet is cracked. Not the shallow cracking of summer drought, but deep fissures that run down into darkness, the kind of cracking that happens when a landscape has been thirsty for so long it has simply given up hoping. The cracks are perfectly geometric in places, hexagonal plates of oxidized sediment arranged like tiles on the floor of an ancient building. No one laid them. No hand shaped them. They formed themselves over thousands of years of drying and contracting and settling. Nothing moves here. And yet this world is alive. Not in any way you would immediately recognize. Not with the movement and color and noise you associate with living things. But alive, in the way that a world balanced perfectly on the edge of something enormous is alive. Waiting. Holding its breath. You do not know it yet, but you are standing at the beginning of one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of life on this planet. The age you have stepped into is called the Triassic. And nothing about it will remain as it appears to you now. The red world is about to give birth to giants. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Close your eyes if you have not already. Let your breathing slow just a little. Let the day you have just lived settle down behind you like sediment drifting to the bottom of a deep, undisturbed lake. You do not need to carry it right now. The names and the hours and the things left unfinished will be there when you wake. For now there is only this. You are about to travel a very long way. Not across distance but across time. We are going to go back 250 million years, to a world that shares our planet's bones but almost none of its flesh. A world without birds. Without flowers. Without grass or mammals or anything you would call familiar. A world rebuilt from almost nothing, still raw, still finding its footing after the worst catastrophe life has ever known. This is the Triassic. And it is stranger and more beautiful and more important than almost anyone realizes. The story of the Triassic is the story of how life comes back. How the empty places fill themselves again. How new shapes emerge from silence and dust and slowly, patiently, over millions upon millions of years, become the ancestors of everything we know. The dinosaurs are part of this story. But they are not the only part. Every creature in every ocean and forest and desert of the Triassic world has a role to play. Every extinction leaves a door open. Every new species walking through that door changes what comes next. Settle deeper. The red plains of ancient Pangea are waiting. The story is about to begin. To understand the Triassic you have to understand what it was built on. And what it was built on was ruin. 252 million years ago the world ended. Not in the dramatic, sudden way of an asteroid strike. Not in a single blinding moment of fire and darkness. It ended slowly over thousands of years, in a way that was somehow worse for its slowness. It ended in heat and acid, and the gradual poisoning of every system that had kept life going for 300 million years before that. The event is called the Permian-Triassic extinction. Scientists sometimes call it the Great Dying. Those two words carry more weight than almost any other two words in the history of this planet. Because what they describe is this: 96% of all marine species, gone. 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species, gone. The oceans, which had been teeming with life since the Cambrian, turned anoxic and acidic and largely silent. The forests that had covered the great supercontinent of Pangea collapsed, their root systems rotting, their canopies falling into rivers swollen with sediment and ash. Insects, which are almost impossible to kill, declined significantly. That last fact, perhaps more than any other, tells you how bad it really was. When insects are losing ground, the world is in very serious trouble. The cause was Siberia. Or more precisely, the Siberian Traps, a vast volcanic province that erupted on a scale human language is not quite equipped to describe. For roughly 2 million years, lava poured from cracks in the Earth's crust in what is now northern Russia, covering an area the size of Europe in layer upon layer of basalt. But the lava itself was not the killer. What came with the lava was the killer. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, hydrogen sulfide. Atmospheric poisons injected in quantities that overwhelmed every natural buffering system the planet possessed. Temperatures rose by 15 to 20 degrees Celsius over baseline. The oceans acidified. Hydrogen sulfide bubbled up from dying seas and drifted across coastlines that were already struggling. The sky itself became a hazard. And then, very slowly, over thousands of years, the eruptions began to quiet. The world that was left behind was almost unrecognizable. Stand in the early Triassic and you would stand in a place emptied of nearly everything. The coastlines were bare. The interiors were bare. The seas were warm and shallow and largely devoid of the reef structures and diverse communities that had made them so productive. The soils, where they existed at all, were thin and unstable, stripped of the root networks that had held them in place. Erosion was everywhere. Sediment cascaded into rivers and rivers poured sediment into seas, and the whole cycle of rock and water and soil that life depends on was running in a kind of traumatized slow motion. The temperature was extraordinary. Early Triassic Earth was among the hottest periods in the entire Phanerozoic. The equatorial regions were essentially uninhabitable zones of lethal heat during the day, temperatures regularly exceeding 50 degrees Celsius in the shade. Animals and plants that tried to establish themselves near the equator found conditions that their physiology simply could not accommodate. Life, what remained of it, was pushed toward higher latitudes, toward the poles, toward the margins of a planet that had become hostile to its own inhabitants. And yet, here is the thing that matters. Here is the thing worth carrying with you into sleep. Life did not end. It came terrifyingly close. Some estimates suggest the total biomass of Earth, the combined weight of every living thing on the planet, dropped by 90% or more during the Great Dying. Ecosystems that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build were dismantled in what amounts to an eye blink of geological time. But in scattered refuges, in isolated valleys and deep ocean basins and high-latitude coastal zones where conditions remained marginally tolerable, life held on. A few species of early reptiles. Some amphibians. A handful of mammal-like synapsids clinging to existence in whatever shelter they could find. In the oceans, a scattering of fish, some bivalves, a few species of nautiloid. Barely enough to rebuild from. But enough. This is the inheritance of the Triassic. A nearly empty planet. A landscape of red rock and shallow seas and thin soils and wide open skies. And in the cracks and margins of that emptied world, the survivors. They were not impressive to look at, these early survivors. The dominant land animals of the very earliest Triassic were creatures called Lystrosaurus, pig-sized synapsids with broad bodies and a kind of enduring, blunt stubbornness to their design. They were herbivores probably. They moved through a landscape of sparse vegetation and dried riverbeds, cropping whatever plant material they could find with their keratinous beaks. They were not beautiful animals. They were not particularly fast or clever. But they were extraordinarily resilient. Lystrosaurus fossils have been found on every continent, evidence that this one genus, or perhaps a handful of very closely related species, spread across the world in the aftermath of the extinction. They were the rats of the early Triassic. Not elegant, not dominant, simply everywhere. Alongside them lived the first Archosaurs, a group whose name means ruling reptiles and whose descendants would eventually include the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs and the crocodilians. These early Archosaurs were slender-bodied, bipedally capable animals, some of them, though many moved on four limbs. They were predators mostly or omnivores. They filled the predator niches that had been emptied by the extinction of the great synapsid hunters. They were not large yet. They were not dominant yet. They were simply present, and in a world this empty, presence is its own kind of power. The plants were perhaps the strangest part of the early Triassic world. For a period right after the extinction, the fossil record shows something called a fungal spike. A horizon in the rock where fungal spores overwhelm almost everything else. The forests were dead. The vegetation was dead. And across this landscape of organic decay, fungi bloomed in extraordinary abundance, digesting the bodies of everything that had come before. After the fungi came ferns, as they almost always do after catastrophe. Ferns are the pioneer plants, the first things to move back into disturbed ground. Their spores travel on the wind. Their root systems are simple and undemanding. They ask very little of the soil and receive very little in return, but they grow, and in growing they begin the slow work of rebuilding something that can eventually support more. After the ferns came the seed plants. Early conifers, cycads, and seed ferns, the last survivors of plant lineages that had defined the Permian forests. They were slower to recover than the ferns. They needed more from the soil, more stability, more time. But as the decades and centuries and millennia accumulated, they spread. Patches of woodland appeared on the most stable ground, near rivers, on sheltered slopes. The world was greening again. It was going to take millions of years. The ocean recovery was even slower. Marine ecosystems depend on intricate relationships between species at every level of the food web, from the smallest phytoplankton to the largest predators. Rebuild the phytoplankton and you still need the zooplankton that eat them. Rebuild the zooplankton and you still need the small fish that feed on them. Build up the small fish and then, finally, you might have something for larger predators to eat. Every level of the web depends on the levels below it. And the Permian extinction had not merely thinned the web. It had torn it apart almost entirely. The early Triassic oceans are sometimes described as disaster faunas, communities dominated by a small number of opportunistic species rather than the rich, diverse assemblages of before. Certain types of bivalves, simple filter feeders, spread across the shallow seafloors in vast numbers, simply because the competition that would have limited them was gone. The Chlorea, a flat clam-like creature, is found in early Triassic deposits worldwide, its simple shell repeated again and again in the rock record, a kind of signature fossil of emptiness. These disaster faunas were not ecosystems in any full sense. They were placeholders. Signs that the machinery of life was still running, however unevenly, however diminished. And then, very slowly, through the early Triassic, through the Induan stage and into the Olenekian, things began to shift. Diversity fractionally increased. New species appeared. Old lineages that had survived in small numbers began to cautiously expand. The empty niches began to attract evolutionary experimentation. Something was beginning. The world of the early Triassic was a world of extraordinary possibility. Not because it was rich. It was not rich. It was impoverished in ways that are difficult to fully imagine. But impoverishment creates space. And space is what evolution needs, above almost everything else, to work its slow, patient magic. The competitors were gone. The predators were few. The ecological niches that had been locked in place for hundreds of millions of years by entrenched, specialized, deeply evolved communities were suddenly open. And into those open spaces life began to pour. The red rocks of the early Triassic, those layers of oxidized sediment that geologists find on every continent, are both a record of devastation and a record of patience. Layer by layer, slowly they give way to something slightly different. Slightly more complex. Slightly more diverse. The rock itself changes color as different minerals accumulate, as soils form and deepen, as the chemistry of the world adjusts to new conditions. Reading those layers is like reading a slow, measured recovery. A planet breathing again carefully, one breath at a time. The Triassic was going to be the most important 51 million years in the history of land life. But it did not begin with triumph or abundance. It began with quiet. With emptiness. With a few stubborn survivors in a red and echoing world, doing what life always does when it finds itself with room to move. It began to explore. Let that thought settle with you as you drift. The red plains stretching in every direction. The thin wind moving over cracked clay. The small, unglamorous creatures moving carefully through a world that is almost entirely theirs. They do not know what they are beginning. They do not know that their descendants will shake the ground and darken the sky and rule this planet for 165 million years. They are only alive. Only present. Only doing the next thing and the thing after that. That is enough. For now, that is everything. The question of how life rebuilds is one of the most profound in all of evolutionary biology. We know the outcomes. We have the fossil record. We can trace the lineages, mark the appearances, document the diversifications. But the mechanisms of rebuilding, the actual ecological and evolutionary processes by which a nearly empty world becomes a full one again, these are still the subject of active research and considerable debate. What we do know is that rebuilding does not happen uniformly. It does not proceed at the same pace in all environments or with all groups of organisms simultaneously. Some niches refill quickly because the organisms best suited to them survive the extinction in quantity and diversified rapidly. Others remain empty for millions of years, waiting for the evolutionary innovation that will produce an organism capable of exploiting them. The pattern of post-extinction recovery is almost always patchy and uneven, a mosaic of early recovery in some areas and continued impoverishment in others. The earliest Triassic oceans, those disaster faunas we have mentioned, are a good illustration of this patchiness. In the most affected regions, the recovery was genuinely slow. The complex, diverse communities of the Permian, with their elaborate food webs and highly specialized organisms, were replaced by simplified communities that remained simplified for millions of years. The Chlorea communities of the earliest Triassic, those vast plains of a single filter-feeding bivalve, were not early stages of recovery so much as they were the ecological equivalent of a blank page. They occupied space and processed nutrients, but they were not yet the foundation of anything complex. In other regions, where local conditions had been somewhat less catastrophic, recovery was faster. Certain high-latitude sites and certain unusual environments like hydrothermal vents and cold seeps on the ocean floor preserved refugia where more complex communities survived through the extinction and became the nuclei of recovery. These refugia were the seed banks of the post-extinction world, the pools of diversity from which the rebuilding would draw. On land, the recovery had its own geography. The synapsid herbivores that survived the extinction, the Lystrosaurus and its relatives, were concentrated in the southern portions of Pangea, in what is now Antarctica and southern Africa, where the climate had been somewhat less extreme during the worst of the Siberian Traps eruptions. From these southern concentrations, they spread northward as conditions permitted. The pattern of their spread is preserved in the fossil record, a gradual geographical expansion that took thousands to tens of thousands of years but that eventually populated much of the supercontinent with these enduring survivors. The Archosaurs, whose ancestors had survived the extinction in very small numbers, diversified quickly once conditions stabilized. They had several advantages. Their more upright posture made them more energetically efficient than many of the other survivors. Their egg-laying, with relatively large, well-provisioned eggs, gave their offspring a better start in life than the small, helpless young of some other groups. And they were, apparently, physiologically flexible in ways that allowed them to exploit a wide range of conditions. The earliest Archosaurs spread across the recovering Triassic landscape with a rapidity that suggests they were not limited by the same constraints that kept other groups confined to specific refugia. The plants as always led the way. Without plant cover, without the soil-binding effects of roots and the organic matter cycling driven by plant growth and decomposition, the landscape was unstable in ways that made animal colonization difficult. But the ferns were there, and the early conifers were there, and they began their patient work of stabilizing and enriching the soil, of building the physical structure that more complex communities would need. Watch soil form if you can find a place where raw rock is being colonized by the first organisms. It happens slowly enough that no single observation reveals the process, but over years and decades you can see the beginning of it. Lichens on bare rock, their acid secretions beginning to break down the mineral surface. Mosses establishing in crevices where a little mineral soil has accumulated. The first small flowering plants or ferns where the moss mat has thickened enough to hold moisture. Then the deeper-rooted plants and the invertebrates that come with them, and the vertebrates that follow the invertebrates. The whole process, from bare rock to complex community, can take decades to centuries in small areas, millions of years at geological scales. The early Triassic landscape was undergoing this process everywhere. The bare, ash-covered, eroded surface of the immediate post-extinction world was being colonized slowly by the pioneers. And the pioneers were making it possible for what came after them, which would make it possible for what came after that, in the long, incremental, patient rebuilding that is one of the most fundamental processes in Earth history. Rest in the patience of that rebuilding. The slowness of soil forming. The quietness of a fern growing in the crack of a rock. The unhurried spreading of a conifer forest across a recovering landscape. These are not dramatic events. They do not announce themselves. They simply happen, day by day and season by season and year by year, and eventually they become the world. As everything eventually becomes the world. As you will, in the morning, become again the world you left when you closed your eyes tonight. Not yet. Sleep first. There is a quality of light in the early morning, just before the sun fully clears whatever horizon lies to the east of you, when everything looks slightly unreal. The colors are softer than they will become. The shadows are longer and gentler. The world holds itself at a slight remove from ordinary time, as if it is not quite sure yet whether to commit to the day. This is the quality of light you would live in if you lived in the early Triassic. Not literally, of course. But in terms of the world's relationship to the abundance and complexity that would eventually come, the early Triassic was a world in that pre-dawn state. Everything was softer, less certain, less committed. The food webs were thin. The ecosystems were simple. The animals were mostly small, mostly unspecialized, mostly just surviving rather than thriving. It was a world in the early stages of deciding what to become. The survivors of the Great Dying faced a peculiar challenge. They had inherited a planet with almost no competition, almost no predation, almost no ecological structure of any kind. For most of evolutionary history that sounds like paradise. But paradise, it turns out, is complicated. Evolution does not simply accelerate when competition is removed. It gropes at first, tries things. Many of those things fail. The survivors of mass extinctions often produce strange, transitional forms, animals that fill niches imperfectly, that are doing jobs they were not exactly designed for, that persist simply because nothing else is around to replace them. The early Triassic is full of these creatures. Consider the temnospondyls. These were large amphibians, some of them very large, predatory animals that had survived the Permian extinction in reduced form and now found themselves, briefly, at the top of the food chain in freshwater environments. Imagine an animal like a flattened, wide-headed salamander, but one that might grow to 3 or 4 meters in length, that lay in riverbeds waiting for anything that moved past, that breathed through a combination of lungs and permeable skin, that was perfectly suited to warm, shallow, oxygen-reduced water because that was the only kind of water the early Triassic rivers tended to offer. Temnospondyls were specialists of the impoverished world. They were not elegant apex predators. They were opportunists, and for a few million years, they were the biggest things in many freshwater ecosystems. The land was stranger still. The dominant animals were those synapsids we have already met, the Lystrosaurus-like herbivores and the various small carnivores that preyed on them. But even within those groups, the Triassic was experimenting. Different lineages were trying different body sizes, different diets, different strategies for making a living in a recovering world. Some synapsids pushed toward larger body sizes, perhaps exploiting the abundant plant material that began to spread as vegetation recovered. Others stayed small, hunting insects and smaller animals in the undergrowth. The Archosaurs were watching all of this from the margins. The Archosaur body plan is one of the most successful designs in the history of vertebrate life, and the early Triassic is where it began to show its potential. The earliest Archosaurs, forms like Proterocampsids and the ancestors of what would become the 2 great Archosaur lineages, were small to medium-sized reptiles, mostly carnivorous, with a posture that ranged from sprawling to semi-erect. What made them different from the synapsids around them was subtle but crucial. Their ankle joints were different. Their skulls were structured differently, with openings in the bone that lightened the head and changed the mechanical advantage of the jaw muscles. They breathed differently, in ways that would become more significant as their descendants grew larger. And they reproduced differently, in ways that made their eggs more resilient, their offspring more capable of surviving in a wider range of conditions. These were not glamorous advantages. They did not make the early Archosaurs obviously superior to their synapsid neighbors. But they were advantages that compounded over millions of years, that became more and more significant as the world changed around them, that turned out, in retrospect, to be exactly the right toolkit for the world the Triassic was about to become. Meanwhile, the landscape itself was changing in ways that were setting the stage for everything to come. The great supercontinent of Pangea, which had been in existence since before the Permian, was beginning to show the first very early signs of the stresses that would eventually tear it apart. The continental crust was under tension in places. Deep faults were forming, rift valleys were beginning to open, and while the full breakup of Pangea was still many millions of years away, its approach was already shaping the climate. The arrangement of land and sea affects atmospheric circulation patterns, ocean currents, rainfall distribution and temperature gradients. As Pangea began to shift, however subtly, the climate shifted with it. The early Triassic climate was extreme by any standard. Hot, dry, and unstable were the defining characteristics. Temperatures swung dramatically between day and night, between seasons, between years. Monsoons brought intense rainfall to coastal zones while the interior of the continent baked in a permanent desert heat. The temperature gradient between the poles and the equator was far less pronounced than it is today, meaning that even high-latitude regions experienced warmth that would seem extraordinary now. Antarctica, which was part of Pangea and positioned much further north than it is today, had forests. It was not tropical, but it was temperate, which is remarkable to consider. The seas that surrounded Pangea were dominated by the Tethys Ocean, a great warm body of water that spread across the tropics, and the Panthalassic Ocean, which covered most of the rest of the globe. These were not the complex, biodiverse oceans of the Permian, not yet. But they were recovering. Slowly, the disaster faunas were being replaced by more diverse communities. New groups of marine animals were appearing, groups that would go on to define the Mesozoic seas. Ammonoids, the coiled shell cephalopods that would become one of the most successful and prolific groups in the history of the oceans, diversified explosively from the few lineages that had survived the extinction. Their evolutionary radiation in the early Triassic is one of the fastest documented in the fossil record, species after species appearing as they spread into the empty ocean. On land, the plant communities were the primary architects of recovery. You cannot have complex animal life without complex plant life. The animals follow the plants always, and the Triassic plants were doing something remarkable. They were not simply re-establishing the plant communities of the Permian. They were building something new. The dichroidium flora, The seed fern forest that had dominated the southern supercontinent of Gondwana spread widely in the early Triassic, filling forest niches across temperate latitudes. These were not the same forests that had stood before the extinction. They were simplified versions, reduced in diversity but functional, providing shade and structural complexity and the beginnings of the layered forest habitats that complex animal communities require. In the northern reaches of Pangea, in what would become North America, Europe, and Asia, different plant communities established themselves. Conifers were increasingly important here, their drought-tolerant physiology well-suited to the harsh interior climates of the northern portions of the supercontinent. Early relatives of the modern Araucaria, the monkey puzzle tree, spread across dry upland habitats. Their resinous wood and needle-like leaves, resistant to fungal attack and desiccation, made them perfect colonizers of the stressed, unstable landscapes of the early recovery. The insects were rebuilding too. This might seem like a small detail, but it is not. Insects are foundational to almost every terrestrial ecosystem. They pollinate plants. They decompose organic matter. They form the base of food webs that support everything from small lizards to large carnivores. An ecosystem without insects is barely an ecosystem at all. The early Triassic insect communities were simplified relative to what had existed before, but they were recovering. Beetles, flies, and various primitive insects diversified in the warm, humid conditions near rivers and lakes, their populations exploding whenever local conditions created abundant food. And what were the vertebrates doing with all this rebuilding? They were doing what they always do. They were following the food. The patterns of the early Triassic are patterns of cautious expansion. Animals moving slowly outward from refuges, testing new environments, failing in some and succeeding in others. The fossil record from this period is patchy, partly because preservation conditions were often poor, partly because the animals themselves were rare, spread thinly across a vast and mostly empty continent. But the fossils that do exist tell a consistent story. A world that is thin on species but rich in ecological opportunity, gradually filling, slowly rebuilding, the architecture of complexity being laid down one species at a time. By the middle of the early Triassic, perhaps 2 or 3 million years after the extinction, something had shifted. The disaster faunas of the immediate aftermath were being replaced by more diverse communities. The Archosaurs were becoming more varied, diversifying into new body plans and ecological roles. The synapsids, though they would never regain the dominance they had held in the Permian, were producing new lineages, including the ancestors of the cynodont group that would eventually give rise to true mammals. The seas were recovering measurably. The plants were covering more of the landscape. The world was not healed. It would not be healed for millions of years. But the trajectory was clear. Life, which had come so close to ending, had not only survived. It was rebuilding with a new set of players, a new arrangement of species, and the early outlines of the world that would eventually become the Mesozoic, the Middle Age of Earth, the age of the great reptiles, the age that would produce the largest land animals this planet has ever known. The first architects of this new world were humble creatures. A pig-sized synapsid with a blunt beak, picking its way through sparse vegetation. A small archosaur pausing on a riverbank, head tilted, watching for movement. A fern uncurling its fronds in the thin soil of a recently stabilized slope. None of them knew what they were building. They were only living. But living was enough. Let yourself feel the weight of that, somewhere deep in your body, where words are less important than sensation. Everything that exists today, every creature and ecosystem and forest and reef, traces back through an unbroken chain of living to those early Triassic survivors. There was never a moment when life stopped. There was never a gap. Through the worst catastrophe in the history of complex organisms, through 2 million years of extinction and ecological collapse, through the long slow recovery of a poisoned world, the thread of living continued. It continues still. Breathe with that. Let it be something soft and steady, like the sound of a shallow river moving over smooth stone. You are part of that unbroken chain. So is everything around you, everything that was ever alive, everything that will ever be alive. The thread reaches back through the red rocks of the early Triassic, through the catastrophe before it, through 3.5 billion years of patient, persistent, extraordinary living. It does not break. It has never broken. Rest in that. The fossil record of the early Triassic has improved enormously over the past few decades, with new discoveries from Antarctica, Greenland, South Africa, and China filling in gaps that once seemed unbridgeable. One of the most important recent contributions has been the detailed study of early Archosaur evolution, the group that would give rise to both dinosaurs and crocodilians, through comprehensive phylogenetic analyses that integrate dozens of new specimens and reinterpret older ones in light of new techniques. The picture that emerges is of an Archosaur radiation in the early and middle Triassic that was far more diverse and ecologically varied than older reconstructions suggested. The traditional view that the early Archosaurs were simply precursors to the more interesting animals that came later has been replaced by an appreciation of them as fully realized ecological players in their own right, filling a wide variety of niches in the recovering ecosystems of the early Triassic world. The Proterocampsid Archosaurs, for example, were a group of medium-sized, semi-aquatic animals from South America that represent one of the earliest Archosaur radiations. They were not on the lineage that would lead to dinosaurs. They were more closely related to the crocodilian lineage. But they were present, living, doing ecological work in the early Triassic floodplain environments of Gondwana. Their fossils are found in the same deposits as Lystrosaurus, in the layers just above the Permian-Triassic boundary, making them among the earliest large vertebrates to colonize the post-extinction landscape. The speed with which the Archosaurs diversified after the Great Dying is one of the more striking patterns in the early Triassic record. Within 5 to 10 million years of the extinction, multiple Archosaur lineages were present across the supercontinent, already beginning to diverge into the ecological roles that would define the group for the rest of the Mesozoic. This speed of diversification is not surprising from the perspective of evolutionary theory. Empty ecological niches are a powerful driver of rapid evolution. When the competition is absent, when the selection pressure is primarily from the physical environment rather than from other organisms, evolution can move quickly, producing new forms in hundreds of thousands of years rather than millions. The Lystrosaurus world was the world these new Archosaurs first encountered. The Lystrosaurus herds, moving across the recovering landscape in search of food and water, were the dominant feature of the early Triassic terrestrial environment. Their abundance, documented in fossil assemblages from South Africa, Antarctica, China, Russia, and India, was extraordinary. At some sites, Lystrosaurus makes up more than 90% of all fossil vertebrates found. This kind of dominance by a single species or genus, so-called monoculture conditions, is characteristic of post-extinction recovery faunas. It reflects the absence of competition and the exploitation of a widespread, abundant food resource, in Lystrosaurus's case probably the recovering plant communities of the early Triassic. The Archosaurs that moved through this Lystrosaurus world were, at first, small and opportunistic. They were not the dominant animals. Lystrosaurus, by sheer abundance, dominated any landscape it inhabited. But the Archosaurs were there and they were watching, evolving, waiting for their moment. Their moment would come in the Middle Triassic, as Lystrosaurus and its immediate relatives declined and the ecological landscape opened up again. The decline of Lystrosaurus is as remarkable in some ways as its initial abundance. The animal that had been everywhere in the earliest Triassic, that had apparently survived when nearly everything else had not, that had spread across Pangea in the aftermath of the extinction, declined and eventually went extinct before the Middle Triassic. The exact causes of its decline are not fully understood. It may have been replaced by more efficient competitors as the Archosaurs diversified. It may have been affected by the climate changes of the early to Middle Triassic transition. It may simply have been the victim of its own success, having spread so widely and exploited its ecological role so thoroughly that the conditions that had made it successful eventually changed away from it. The lesson is the same lesson that the Rhynchosaurs would teach later, and that the Pseudosuchians would teach later still. No success lasts forever. Every dominant group eventually declines. The world changes, and what was perfectly adapted to the old world becomes less well-suited to the new one. The key to persistence, to the kind of long evolutionary survival that we associate with the mammal lineage, is not being dominant but being adaptable. Not being the most abundant but being the most flexible. Not filling the central niche but remaining capable of occupying whatever niche is available when the central ones are gone. The cynodonts survived the Great Dying because they were not dominant. They were too small, too versatile, too ecologically peripheral to be significantly affected by the collapse of the dominant large animal community. And in being peripheral they were safe. The margins of ecosystems, the niches that dominant species ignore because they are too small or too variable or too demanding, these are the refuges where the next dominant lineage is always quietly developing. You are the product of margin survival. Your ancestors survived every extinction in the history of complex life by being the kind of animals that do not attract the attention of the forces that end the dominant lineages. Small, versatile, nocturnal, insectivorous, reproductively flexible, not spectacular, not dominant, simply persistent. And now, 250 million years and a great many crises later, Their descendants are building computers and writing books and lying in beds listening to stories about ancient worlds and letting the day dissolve into sleep. The margins were the right place to be. Sleep now. The ground beneath your feet is moving. You cannot feel it. No living thing has ever been able to feel it directly. The movement is far too slow for any nervous system to detect. But it is happening here in the Middle Triassic, just as it is happening right now beneath your feet as you lie in the dark on the other side of 240 million years of time. The continents are moving. Have always been moving. Will always be moving. They are carried on plates of lithosphere that float on the viscous rock of the mantle below, driven by convection currents so massive and so slow that a human life would be a single heartbeat in their rhythm. In the Triassic, this movement is about to become one of the most important forces shaping life on Earth. Pangea, the supercontinent that had dominated the planet for over 100 million years, was beginning to fracture. Not dramatically, not in a way that any creature living through it could perceive. But the stress was building. Deep beneath the crust, the convection patterns in the mantle were pulling at the continent's foundations, stretching rock that had been welded together since the late Paleozoic, introducing cracks and weaknesses into structures that had seemed permanent. The first sign was heat. Rifts begin with heat, with magma rising under the crust and bulging it upward, thinning it, making it more susceptible to tearing. In the Middle Triassic, the first rift structures were beginning to form in the region that would eventually become the Central Atlantic. These were not yet open ocean. They were low-lying rift valleys, elongated depressions forming between uplifted shoulders of rock, filling with sediment, occasionally filling with water. Think of the East African Rift Valley today, that long corridor of lakes and lowlands stretching from the Red Sea toward Mozambique, and you have a reasonable image of what the early Atlantic Rift looked like in the Triassic. These rift valleys were, perhaps surprisingly, excellent places for life. The low-lying topography collected water. The volcanic activity associated with rifting added nutrients to soils and created geothermal conditions that some organisms exploited. The geographical isolation created by rift walls separated populations of plants and animals, driving evolutionary divergence. What happened in the rift valleys of the Triassic did not stay in the rift valleys. It spread, as life always spreads when it finds a productive corner of the world to establish itself in. But the larger significance of Pangea's breaking was climatic. The supercontinent effect, that extreme aridity and temperature instability that had defined Pangea's interior for so long, was beginning to moderate. As rifts formed and small seaways began to develop along the continent's edges, moisture could penetrate slightly further inland than before. The monsoon systems that had characterized Pangea's climate were shifting. Not disappearing, not reversing, but changing in their patterns, their intensity, their seasonal distribution. For life on land, this was significant. The hyperarid interior of Pangea had always been a barrier to dispersal. Animals and plants that had established themselves in one part of the supercontinent could not easily move to another if the route required crossing hundreds of miles of lifeless desert. But as the Triassic progressed, those barriers began to shift and in places to thin. Corridors of slightly less hostile habitat opened up. Populations that had been isolated from each other for millions of years came into contact, sometimes competing, sometimes hybridizing, always influencing each other's evolution. The seas were also changing. The Tethys Ocean, that great tropical body of water that occupied the space between the northern and southern portions of Pangea, was gradually widening as the continent rift. Its waters were warm and shallow over the continental shelves, conditions that would prove extraordinarily productive for marine life as the recovery from the Permian extinction continued. The Tethys would become the engine of Mesozoic marine biodiversity, a nursery for the great marine reptile lineages and the increasingly diverse communities of fish and invertebrates that filled Triassic and later Jurassic seas. The North, the region that would eventually become Europe, Asia, and North America, was one of the more interesting parts of the Triassic world. Here the climate was extremely seasonal, with warm, wet summers and cool, dry winters in the higher latitudes, and in the southern portions of this northern landmass, a warm, semi-arid climate that supported sparse open woodlands and scrublands. The fossil record from the Germanic Basin, the Muschelkalk and Kuiper formations of what is now Germany and surrounding countries, gives us an unusually detailed picture of life in this part of the Triassic world. The Germanic Basin in the Middle Triassic was a shallow inland sea, connected to the Tethys, a warm body of water no more than a few tens of meters deep across much of its extent, floored with carbonate mud, heated by the Triassic sun, periodically cut off from open ocean circulation. In the deeper waters, life was rich by Triassic standards. Ammonoids spiraled through the water column. Early relatives of modern shellfish filtered the plankton-rich water. A variety of fish hunted in the shallows. Occasionally the bones of marine reptiles are found in these sediments, large-eyed animals built for deep diving, their fossils sometimes remarkably complete. On the surrounding land, in the low-lying coastal plains and the inland desert that stretched beyond the horizon, the story was different. The land of the Germanic region in the Middle Triassic was hot and dry for much of the year. The vegetation was sparse, dominated by drought-tolerant conifers and cycads on the better-drained soils, with ferns and horsetails along watercourses. Animals clustered near water. Their tracks are preserved in the fine-grained sediments of ancient lockshores, a record of movement and congregation that is almost poignant in its detail. A three-toed footprint in red mud. The meandering trail of something smaller. The claw marks of an Archosaur investigating the waterline. In the south, in what would become South America and Africa, conditions were somewhat different. The southern portions of Pangea had a different climate regime, influenced by their higher latitude and by the persistence of the great Gondwanan highland regions that had survived the Permian relatively intact. Here the vegetation was denser, the rainfall more reliable, the ecosystems more complex than in the hot, dry north. The dichroidium forests of the southern Triassic were among the most biodiverse plant communities of the entire period, creating layered habitats of a kind that had not existed since before the extinction. And it was in these more productive southern environments that some of the most important animals of the Triassic were evolving. The cynodonts, those advanced mammal-like synapsids that had survived the Great Dying in reduced numbers, were undergoing a remarkable diversification in the Middle Triassic. The cynodont body plan was, in retrospect, extraordinarily versatile. These were animals with differentiated teeth, which is a seemingly minor detail that turns out to be enormously important. Most reptiles have simple, uniform teeth, variations on a cone or a point, useful for catching and puncturing but not for the complex processing of food that allows an animal to extract maximum energy from a variety of sources. Cynodonts had incisors for grasping, canines for killing, and increasingly complex cheek teeth for actually chewing food. This meant they could eat things that other animals could not efficiently process. Tough plant material, hard-shelled insects, a wider variety of prey. Chewing, it turns out, is one of the key adaptations that leads to the mammalian lifestyle. When you can chew, you extract more energy from food. When you extract more energy from food, you can support a higher metabolic rate. When you have a higher metabolic rate, you can maintain a more constant body temperature. When you maintain a constant body temperature, you can be active in a wider range of conditions at night, in the cold, in environments where cold-blooded competitors are sluggish. The cynodonts were not yet mammals. But they were on the road to becoming mammals, and that road ran directly through the Triassic. The other great evolutionary development of the Middle Triassic was the divergence of the Archosaur lineages. The Archosaurs had split by the Middle Triassic into two great groups. On one side, the group that would eventually give rise to crocodilians and their various extinct relatives. On the other, the group that would give rise to pterosaurs and dinosaurs. These two lineages, the Pseudosuchians and the Ornithodorans, would compete for ecological dominance throughout the Triassic, and the outcome of that competition would shape the course of life for the next 200 million years. In the Middle Triassic, the Pseudosuchians were winning. They had produced a remarkable diversity of forms, from small insectivores to massive predators. Some had developed body armor, thick osteoderms embedded in the skin of their backs, that made them effectively impervious to most predators. Others were swift, long-limbed runners, more agile than their body plans might suggest. The Rauisuchians, a group of large pseudosuchian predators, were the apex terrestrial carnivores of the Middle and Late Triassic, animals that filled the niche that would later be held by large theropod dinosaurs. The Ornithodorans were more modest at this point, but they were there. Small, lightly built, bipedally capable in many cases, living in the margins, exploiting the resources that the dominant Pseudosuchians overlooked. The earliest pterosaurs were appearing, small flying reptiles whose evolutionary origins are still somewhat mysterious, but whose presence in the fossil record from the late Middle Triassic onward tells us that flight had been achieved, that the third dimension of the world was being colonized for the first time by vertebrates. And somewhere in the undergrowth, in the forested margins of the Gondwanan South and the scrubby habitats of the northern Triassic world, the very first dinosaurs were beginning to take shape. We will meet them in full soon. For now, know only that they are there. Small, quiet, watching. The continents are moving. The world is changing. And the players are taking their positions for a drama that will run for 165 million years. Feel the stillness of all that distant time. It settles over you like the warmth of the day's last light, gentle and without urgency. The mountains are rising somewhere. The sea is widening somewhere else. The small, warm-blooded ancestors of everything that will eventually follow are sleeping in burrows in the dark. Their hearts beat. Their breath is steady. The world turns around them, carrying them forward through time without their knowledge or consent, toward futures none of them could imagine. This is what the Middle Triassic feels like from the inside. Patient. Vast. Unhurried. You can rest here. The cynodont diversification of the Middle Triassic is one of the more remarkable stories in this already remarkable period. The cynodonts had come close to extinction in the Great Dying. A few lineages survived, and from those few lineages the entire Middle Triassic cynodont radiation emerged. The speed of the diversification relative to the tens of millions of years of stable cynodont evolution in the Permian suggests that the nearly empty ecological landscape of the early Triassic was a powerful accelerant of evolutionary change. Cynognathus, one of the larger and better-known early Triassic cynodonts, was an animal roughly the size of a large dog, with powerful jaws and well-differentiated teeth that suggest a diet of meat, possibly including some degree of bone processing. It was not a small, skulking animal. It was a genuine medium-sized predator, capable of taking prey of substantial size. Its fossils are found in the Cynognathus assemblage zone of South Africa and in equivalent age deposits in Antarctica and South America, evidence that this animal was distributed widely across the southern portions of Pangea. What Cynognathus looked like is partly a matter of inference from its skeletal remains. The bones tell us the proportions, the joint angles, the muscle attachment points, the teeth. But the integument, whether it had fur or scales or something intermediate, is not preserved in the rock. Most paleontologists who specialize in the group believe that advanced cynodonts like Cynognathus likely had at least some fur, at least around the face where the whisker pits in the bone suggest sensitive facial vibrissae. The rest of the body may have had a mixed covering, partly scale-like and partly hair-like, reflecting the transitional nature of these animals. The question of when exactly fur evolved in the mammal lineage is one of the more interesting unresolved questions in paleontology. Fur is a critical adaptation for a warm-blooded animal because it provides thermal insulation, reducing the energy cost of maintaining elevated body temperature. Without fur, a small warm-blooded animal in a cool environment would lose heat so rapidly that the metabolic cost of maintaining body temperature would be prohibitive. The evolution of fur is thus tightly linked to the evolution of endothermy, and tracing one helps trace the other. The small-bodied advanced cynodonts of the late Triassic, the ones most closely related to the first true mammals, almost certainly had full fur coats. The physiological demands of their lifestyle, high metabolism and small bodies in variable thermal environments, would have made fur essentially mandatory. The larger, earlier cynodonts like Cynognathus may have been in an intermediate state, perhaps with facial fur and possibly dorsal pelage but not the full body covering of their smaller, later relatives. The fur is gone. Like the soft tissues, like the colors, like the sounds these animals made and the behaviors they exhibited, the fur of the Triassic cynodonts has not survived in the rock. But the bone record tells us it was coming, that the full mammalian integumentary system was being assembled piece by piece in these animals of the Triassic. Consider also the nesting behavior of cynodonts. We have limited direct evidence for how cynodonts reproduced and cared for their young. But from the modern mammals that are their descendants, and from the indirect fossil evidence of their social and reproductive biology, we can make reasonable inferences. The Trirachidont cynodonts of the Middle Triassic were relatively small animals, small enough that producing many offspring simultaneously would have been energetically possible. But the direction of the mammalian lineage was always toward fewer, larger offspring with more parental investment, not more, smaller offspring with less. This direction reflects the increasingly complex developmental demands of larger mammalian brains. A brain that is going to be more complex in adulthood takes longer to develop, requires more nutrients during development, and benefits more from parental guidance in the postnatal period. The trade-off between quantity and quality in offspring is one of the most fundamental in reproductive biology, and the entire history of the mammalian lineage is a story of moving toward the quality end of that spectrum. The Middle Triassic cynodonts were somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, producing more offspring than modern placental mammals but fewer than their synapsid ancestors, investing more in each offspring than their ancestors had, but not yet committed to the extreme parental investment that would characterize the later mammalian groups. Pangea continued its slow-motion fracture through all of this. The continent was large and the forces driving it apart were enormous, but they were slow, imperceptible to any animal or plant that lived upon it. The rift valleys were deepening slowly. The seaways were very gradually widening. The climate was shifting year by year and decade by decade and millennium by millennium in response to the changing geography. The world was becoming more complex, geographically, and that geographic complexity was driving evolutionary complexity, as isolated populations diverged, as new environments opened up, as the barriers and connections between different regions of the supercontinent changed. You are part of the result of all this complexity. Your existence required not just the survival of specific lineages through specific crises, but the particular pattern of continental movement and climate change and ecological interaction that produced the exact sequence of evolutionary changes that led to you. Change anything significant in the Triassic, shift the timing of Pangea's breakup, alter the severity of the Carnian pluvial episode, prevent the cynodont lineage from developing differentiated teeth, and the chain of consequences might have gone somewhere entirely different. But it went here. Through 51 million years of Triassic and 135 million years of Mesozoic and 66 million years of Cenozoic, through every extinction and radiation and climate upheaval, through every crisis survived and every opportunity taken, it went here. To this. To you. Sleep well in that remarkable improbability. There is a quality to deep water that is difficult to describe to someone who has only ever known it from above. Standing on a shoreline looking out at the ocean, you are seeing a surface. A plane of light and reflection, endlessly variable in its texture and color, beautiful in the way that surfaces are beautiful. But the ocean is not a surface. It is a volume. It descends for kilometers, and in that descending it moves through a series of worlds, each one colder and darker and more pressurized than the one above, each one inhabited by creatures adapted to conditions that would be instantly fatal to the one above. The Triassic Ocean had this same verticality, the same layering, the same sense of world upon world stacked in the dark. And it was, by the Middle and Late Triassic, one of the most extraordinary bodies of water that has ever existed on this planet. After the catastrophe of the Permian extinction, the oceans needed time. How much time is a matter of ongoing research and debate among paleontologists, but the general picture is one of extended recovery measured not in thousands of years but in millions. The earliest Triassic seas, as we have discussed, were dominated by disaster faunas, simplified communities that reflected how much had been lost. But as the Triassic progressed, as the millions of years accumulated, the oceans transformed. The ammonoids led the way. These cephalopods, relatives of the modern nautilus though far more diverse and generally more complex in their shell geometry, had survived the Permian extinction as a single lineage or perhaps a very few lineages, reduced to a precarious handful of species. And then they exploded. The word radiation in evolutionary biology refers to the rapid diversification of a lineage into many different forms and ecological roles, and the ammonoid radiation of the early Triassic is one of the most spectacular examples of this process in the fossil record. Within a few million years, the single surviving lineage had diversified into dozens of families, hundreds of genera, thousands of species. Their coiled shells, ranging from simple flat spirals to complex three-dimensional forms with elaborate suture patterns, filled the ocean in extraordinary abundance. You find ammonoids in Triassic rocks on every continent, in deposits from shallow tropical seas and deep open ocean environments, from the equator to the poles. Their shells are the most common fossils in many Triassic marine formations. Pick up a rock from an alpine limestone quarry from certain formations in North America, from the marine Triassic of what is now Nevada or British Columbia, and you may very well find an ammonoid, its coiled form pressed into the matrix with the casual profusion of a common thing, a thing that once filled the seas in numbers almost beyond imagining. But the ammonoids, numerous as they were not the most dramatic inhabitants of the Triassic Ocean. That distinction belongs to a group of animals that have captured human imagination since their fossils were first discovered, the marine reptiles. The transition of reptiles to a fully aquatic lifestyle is one of evolution's recurring experiments. It has happened independently many times in the history of life, from the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs of the Mesozoic to the mosasaurs of the Cretaceous to the whales and dolphins of the Cenozoic and the sea turtles that persist today. It is almost irresistible as evolutionary moves go. The ocean is enormous. It is full of food. And for an air-breathing vertebrate that can maintain a constant body temperature and process food efficiently, it offers extraordinary opportunities for large body size, for the kind of gigantism that is difficult to sustain on land where the weight of the body becomes a structural problem. The Triassic marine reptiles were the pioneers of this transition, and they were among the most successful and extraordinary animals that have ever lived. The ichthyosaurs were perhaps the most dramatic example. Their name means fish lizard, which is accurate as far as it goes but gives no sense of the extraordinary convergence these animals represent. Ichthyosaurs were reptiles, descended from land-living ancestors that returned to the sea sometime in the early Triassic. And in returning to the sea, they evolved a body form so similar to modern dolphins and tuna that when early naturalists first found their fossils in the cliffs of the English Jurassic coast, they had difficulty accepting that these were reptiles at all. The streamlined body, the large eyes, the crescent-shaped tail fin, the dorsal fin, these are the features of a highly efficient open-water predator, and the ichthyosaurs had developed them independently of the fish and marine mammals that share the same basic design. In the Triassic, ichthyosaurs ranged from relatively small eel-like forms in the early part of the period to some of the largest animals that have ever lived by the late Triassic. The Shastasaurid ichthyosaurs of the late Triassic, known from remarkable specimens found in Nevada and British Columbia, reached lengths that may have exceeded 20 meters, making them among the largest marine predators in the fossil record. Their enormous size was supported by the abundance of the Tethys and Panthalassic oceans, by the recovery of marine food webs that had been devastated by the Permian extinction and were now producing fish and cephalopod prey in enormous quantities. Imagine for a moment the ocean surface in the late Triassic. You are floating on warm water, the kind of tropical warmth that feels like bath water, the Tethys under a sun that is not quite the same sun as the one you know but close enough. Below you the water is clear and green, shading to blue and then to darkness. You are waiting. Something is coming. Not directly at you but near you at the surface, surfacing to breathe. The body that breaks the water is vast. Its back is dark against the blue sky, and its exhalation is a plume of mist that hangs for a moment before the wind takes it. Then it is gone again, back into the depth, leaving a circle of flat water that slowly fills with ripples. That is the Triassic Ocean. The plesiosaurs were also present, though they were not yet the long-necked giants of popular imagination. The earliest plesiosaurs, forms like Pistosaurus and Nothosaurus from the Middle Triassic, were not fully aquatic. They were transitional animals, more at home near the shore than in open water, capable of coming onto land, their limbs not yet fully transformed into the paddle-like flippers of their later descendants. But they were on the way. You can see the trajectory in the fossils, the gradual lengthening of the neck, the shortening and broadening of the limbs, the deepening of the chest, the adaptations for breath-hold diving. The Nothosaurs in particular were remarkable animals. Long, slender, with relatively small heads packed with sharp interlocking teeth for catching fish, they inhabited the shallow coastal seas of the Tethys with what must have been considerable grace. Their fossils are found in the Alps, in the limestone formations that were once tropical seafloor, their bones sometimes articulated in complete skeletons, sometimes scattered, always telling the same story of animals that had found something extraordinary in the sea. Fish were also undergoing significant changes in the Triassic oceans. The ray-finned fishes, the actinopterygians, which today constitute the vast majority of all fish species on Earth, were diversifying rapidly. Many modern fish lineages trace their origins to the Triassic, to the radiation of this group into the ecological spaces left by the Permian extinction. The Triassic seas were not yet full of recognizable modern fish families, those would come later, in the Jurassic and Cretaceous. But the foundations were being laid. The body plans were being explored. The evolutionary experiments were underway. Sharks were present too, though Triassic sharks were not the large apex predators we associate with the group today. Most were relatively small, specialized for particular ecological roles, some almost flattened bottom feeders, others more active open water hunters. The great white shark and its relatives would not appear until much later. But the shark body plan, ancient and efficient, was present and adapting to the Triassic world just as it had adapted to every world before it. The seafloor of the Triassic Tethys was its own world, separate and complete. Echinoderms, relatives of modern sea urchins and starfish, crawled across carbonate mud in search of organic particles. Bivalves filtered the water in dense aggregations, their shells building up in layers thick enough to become distinct geological formations millions of years later. Crinoids, the sea lilies, spread their feathered arms in the current, passive collectors of the plankton that drifted through the warm tropical water. In the areas where carbonate chemistry was favorable, the beginnings of reef building were underway, new reef builders different from the ones that had been lost in the Permian, constructing different kinds of structures using different organisms. The Triassic reef builders were sponges primarily. Not the soft, flexible bath sponges of modern imagination but massive, rigid calcified sponges that grew in complex branching and tabular forms, creating the kind of three-dimensional structure that other organisms could colonize. These sponge reefs were not as diverse as the coral-dominated reefs of the Permian or the modern ocean, but they were functional. They provided habitat. They created complexity. They were the scaffolding on which more complex communities could begin to assemble. Above all of this, in the column of water between the seafloor and the surface, the plankton drifted. Tiny organisms too small to see with the naked eye, living and dying in billions, their microscopic shells and skeletons falling to the bottom in a perpetual slow rain of organic material. This biological pump, the transport of carbon and organic matter from the productive surface ocean to the dark cold depths, is one of the most important processes in the Earth system. It modulates climate. It drives ocean chemistry. It has been operating, in various forms, for as long as there has been life in the ocean. In the Triassic, the planktonic communities were rebuilding from the trauma of the Permian extinction, and their recovery was one of the most important developments of the entire period. The marine world of the Triassic was not a gentle place. The ichthyosaurs were eating things. The nothosaurs were hunting things. The ammonoids, which were predators themselves as much as they were prey, were pursuing smaller cephalopods and crustaceans through the sunlit water. Death was everywhere in the Triassic Ocean, as it is everywhere in every ocean. But it was productive death, the kind of death that drives ecosystems, that cycles nutrients and transfers energy and keeps the whole complex machinery of marine life running. The ocean is ancient in a way the land is not. Life began in the ocean. The first cells, the first complex organisms, the first animal body plans all arose in the sea. The land is a relatively recent expansion, a bold but risky venture from a world that had been home for 3 billion years. The sea has always been, in some sense, the real world, the original world, the world that everything else is a kind of extension from. Lying in the dark, let yourself think about deep water. Not dangerous water. Not threatening water. Simply deep water, warm and salt, full of life that has no knowledge of shores or land or the distinction between night and day. The ichthyosaur moving through it, enormous and unhurried, the water parting ahead of it and closing behind, leaving no trace except a brief turbulence that settles and is still. The ocean has been doing this for a very long time. It was doing this when nothing that breathed air existed. It will be doing it long after everything that breathes air is gone. There is a comfort in that, somewhere. Not the comfort of being small, exactly. The comfort of being held in something larger and older and more patient than anything you can name. The Triassic Ocean holds you now. Let it. Beyond the surface waters, the depths of the Tethys Sea held their own slow secrets. The deep ocean of the Triassic was poorly oxygenated in places, a legacy of the Permian extinction's long disruption of ocean circulation. Where oxygen was absent, the seafloor was draped in black organic-rich mud, a graveyard of falling organic matter that had no organisms capable of consuming it. These anoxic sediments are among the finest preservers of ancient life, their lack of oxygen suppressing the bacteria that would otherwise decompose shells and bones before they could fossilize. Some of the most exquisitely preserved Triassic marine creatures come from just such environments, animals that sank to the airless bottom and lay undisturbed for 230 million years before we uncovered them. The water column above those dark depths was stratified in ways that determined everything about marine life. A warm, well-lit surface layer, productive and full of plankton, gave way below the thermocline to cold dark water that circulated on timescales of centuries rather than seasons. The ichthyosaurs and nothosaurs lived in the upper zone, dependent on that surface productivity. Their prey, the fish and ammonoids and soft-bodied cephalopods, were also concentrated there. The energy of sunlight captured by microscopic algae at the very surface moved upward through the food web, from algae to zooplankton to small fish to larger fish to the great marine reptiles, each link in the chain consuming and being consumed, the whole system driven by nothing more than light and salt water and time. There were also the turtles. The earliest turtles appear in the Triassic fossil record as another of those remarkable innovations, body plans so successful and so stable that they have barely changed in 220 million years. The turtle shell, that extraordinary structure, is not simply a carapace added over a typical reptile body. It is a fundamental reorganization of the vertebrate skeleton, the ribs broadened and fused to form the upper shell, the shoulder girdle repositioned inside the ribcage in a way that is anatomically unique among all vertebrates. How this reorganization happened is still debated, but by the Middle Triassic it was established, and the turtle had found its form. Early turtles like Progonocales from the late Triassic were not markedly different from their modern descendants in overall design. They were already fully shelled, already withdrawn from the world into that fortress of bone, already committed to the strategy of patience and endurance that would carry turtles through every subsequent extinction. They could not retract their heads as fully as modern turtles, and they had small teeth-like projections in their mouths, but the essence of the turtle was already there. Slow. Armored. Ancient beyond all reasonable expectation. The turtle's strategy is a remarkable one. Speed, intelligence, active predation, these are not the turtle's tools. The turtle's tool is time. By making itself difficult to kill, by requiring little food, by tolerating a wide range of conditions, the turtle outlasts. It was doing this in the Triassic, it was doing it through the end Triassic extinction, through the end Cretaceous extinction, through every upheaval the Cenozoic could produce. There are turtles alive today whose lineages have been essentially unchanged for longer than the dinosaurs existed. The turtle is perhaps the most successful large animal body plan in the history of vertebrate life, if success is measured in persistence. Let that thought settle into the dark around you. The turtle in its ancient patience. The ocean in its ancient motion. The seafloor accumulating its slow deposits of shells and skeletons, layer upon layer, time upon time. You do not need to be fast or clever or remarkable to endure. You only need to be here. To be still. To let the world move around you while you rest in the center of it, quiet, enclosed, at ease. The Tethys Sea moves without urgency. It has been moving for a very long time and will continue long after the sound of the rain and the calls of the creatures along its shores have faded to nothing. You can rest in it. You can let its slow rhythms become your slow rhythms. Breathe slowly. The water is warm. The world is very old. The smell would stop you first. Not an unpleasant smell, not exactly. But different. Dense and vegetal in a way that has no modern equivalent. The Triassic air carried the particular combination of aromatic compounds produced by conifers and cycads, that piney, slightly medicinal quality, mixed with the earthier smell of ferns growing in damp ground, and underneath all of it, the mineral smell of exposed rock, of soil that is still thin and young, of a landscape that is geological as much as it is biological. Add to this the warmth, a warmth that presses against exposed skin, not comfortable warmth but not unbearable either, and you have the first impression of a Triassic afternoon. The Middle Triassic, perhaps 240 million years ago, was a world of extraordinary variety. Not the variety of the modern tropics. Not the layered, complex, species-saturated variety of a mature ecosystem with millions of years of elaboration behind it. But a different kind of variety. The variety of a world that is still discovering what is possible. A world running multiple evolutionary experiments simultaneously, in different habitats and different climates across the extent of the great supercontinent, with no predetermined outcome in sight. You would encounter this variety most directly in the animals. And the animals of the Middle Triassic are genuinely strange. Not strange in the way that science fiction imagines alien life as strange, with forms that have no connection to anything familiar. Strange in the way that variations on familiar themes can be strange, when the familiar themes are twisted and extended and rearranged into configurations that should be recognizable but are somehow not quite. The Triassic was full of this kind of strangeness. Animals that are almost crocodiles but not quite. Animals that are almost mammals but not quite. Animals that are almost something else entirely, something that has no living descendants and no common name, something that existed only in this particular window of time and left only its bones in the rock. Take Tanystropheus. If you had encountered this animal on a Triassic lakeshore, you might have needed a few moments to understand what you were seeing. It was a reptile clearly. Scaled, four-legged, with the general proportions of a lizard in its body and legs. But its neck was extraordinary. Tanystropheus had the longest neck, relative to its body size, of any tetrapod that has ever been discovered. Its neck, supported by only 13 elongated vertebrae, made up more than half of its total body length. An animal 6 meters long might have a neck of 3 meters, attached to a body and head that together occupied only the remaining 3. What was this neck for? That question occupied paleontologists for a long time. Recent analysis of its fossil teeth and its likely habitat suggests that Tanystropheus was a shoreline predator, using that extraordinary neck to reach out over water and snatch fish or marine invertebrates from just below the surface. The neck is a fishing rod. It is a strange solution to a straightforward problem, but the Triassic was full of strange solutions. Evolution does not design from scratch. It modifies what already exists, and the modifications it produces are not always the ones that, from a human engineering perspective, would seem most efficient. But Tanystropheus clearly worked. Its fossils span millions of years of Triassic time, found in the alpine formations of what is now Switzerland and Italy and in other Middle Triassic deposits. It was successful. Whatever the neck was doing for it, it was doing it well. Equally strange, though in a completely different direction, was Shringosaurus from the Middle Triassic of India. This was a large herbivore, perhaps 2.5 meters long, belonging to a group called the Archosaurs, reptiles with no close living relatives and no particularly close analogues in the modern world. Shringosaurus had horns. Not the kind of horns you would expect, not the simple spikes or bosses of a fighting herbivore, but a pair of forward-curving horns arising from the snout, giving the animal a face that looks almost bovine, almost familiar, and yet is clearly from a completely different branch of the reptile family tree. Why horns on a Triassic reptile? Almost certainly for the same reason animals develop horns in any period of Earth's history. Display, sexual competition, recognition, perhaps some degree of defense. The social lives of Triassic animals are almost entirely invisible to us. But the bones tell us the behavior was there, coded in structure, even when we cannot read the behavior itself. Then there were the Archosaurs, those heavily armored herbivores we mentioned earlier, the tank-like pseudosuchians that stomped their way through Triassic landscapes on all four legs, their backs protected by rows of bony plates set into the skin. They were successful enough that their fossils are found on multiple continents, evidence of wide geographic distribution and long temporal persistence. They were grazers, probably, or browsers, using their small heads and simple teeth to process low-growing vegetation. They did not have to worry much about predators given the armor. What they did have to worry about was each other, presumably, in the competition for food and territory and mates that is the daily reality for any social herbivore. The Archosaurs are a good illustration of a general principle of the Triassic. The pseudosuchians were, for most of the period, extraordinarily diverse and successful. They had occupied almost every large animal ecological niche on land. There were pseudosuchian apex predators, pseudosuchian large herbivores, pseudosuchian omnivores. The Rauisuchians, the great predatory pseudosuchians, were among the most impressive animals of the Triassic. Animals like Saurosuchus and Prestosuchus were massive, bipedally capable or facultatively bipedal carnivores with skulls longer than your arm, teeth designed for cutting through flesh and bone, and the kind of powerful, athletic build that made them effective hunters of the large herbivores of their time. They were the Triassic equivalent of the great theropod dinosaurs, and in the Middle Triassic they were dominant. But the cynodont synapsids deserve extended attention, because they were doing something that no other group of the Triassic was doing. They were becoming mammals. The process was slow, of course. Geological processes are always slow. But the direction was clear. The cynodonts of the Middle and Late Triassic were progressively acquiring the traits that define modern mammals. Differentiated teeth, as we have discussed, were already there, and were becoming more elaborately differentiated as the lineage diversified. The jaw was changing, the bones at the back of the jaw were gradually being incorporated into the middle ear, a transformation that is one of the most remarkable structural changes in vertebrate evolutionary history. This transformation is documented in extraordinary detail in the fossil record. Intermediate forms where the dentary bone of the lower jaw is large but the post-dentary bones have not yet fully migrated to the middle ear, where the hearing was changing, where the capacity for fine auditory discrimination was increasing. Why was hearing so important? Because cynodonts were increasingly nocturnal animals. Their competitors, the dominant pseudosuchians and early dinosaurs, were largely diurnal. The night was less competitive. But navigating the night required sensory capabilities that could substitute for vision, and in a world of crackling leaves and calling insects and the distant sounds of water, a more sensitive ear was a significant advantage. The Triassic cynodonts were being pushed toward nocturnality by competition, and nocturnality was pushing them toward better hearing, and better hearing was one of the defining mammalian traits. They were also, almost certainly, becoming increasingly warm-blooded. The evidence for this in the fossil record is indirect but compelling. The growth patterns of cynodont bones, as revealed by thin-section histology, show the rapid, continuous growth pattern associated with warm-blooded metabolism. Their tooth-wear patterns suggest diets with high caloric content, consistent with the energetic demands of endothermy. Some fossils appear to show the small pits in the bones of the snout that would have housed the nerves and blood vessels associated with sensitive facial whiskers, structures that could only function effectively in an animal with a certain degree of metabolic heat. Whiskers. In the Triassic. The thought has a certain tenderness to it. The small cynodonts of the Middle and Late Triassic, animals like Chinoquodon and Proboscidon from South America, Cynognathus from Africa and Antarctica, Trirachidon from Southern Africa, these were animals in the process of becoming something new. Their fossil skulls look reptilian and mammalian simultaneously, that combination of inherited reptilian structure and emerging mammalian anatomy that makes them one of the most fascinating groups in the entire fossil record. They are transitional animals in the most profound sense, not failed experiments, not incomplete designs, but living organisms fully adapted to their moment, while also being, in geological retrospect, the ancestors of every mammal that has ever lived. Your ancestors were among them. Mine were among them. The thread runs directly from those small, warm-blooded, insect-eating cynodonts in the forests of the Triassic to the mammals that read books and lie in beds and breathe softly in the dark. Let yourself trace that thread backwards. Not in precise evolutionary detail but in feel. In the quality of small warm things being alive in the dark. In the sense of a nervous system evolved for sensitivity rather than size, for processing information about a complex world rather than simply overpowering it. Your brain, the brain that is relaxing right now, that is letting thoughts become slower and less insistent, is a mammalian brain. It is the product of 250 million years of a particular kind of intelligence, an intelligence that began in the undergrowth of the Triassic, in animals small enough to hide in a footprint of a Rawasuchian. That intelligence survived everything. The Triassic. The end of the Triassic. The age of the dinosaurs. The end of the dinosaurs. Every extinction and catastrophe and climate upheaval. It survived and it grew and it is here now in the dark, breathing slowly, settling towards sleep. The Triassic was full of strange and beautiful animals. The Tanystrophiid reaching for fish over a Tethyan shoreline. The Edosaur moving like a living fortress through sparse Carnian forest. The Cynodont tucking itself into a rocky crevice before dawn, its small heart beating fast, its whiskers reading the air for information, its auditory system so refined it can hear the footstep of an approaching predator 100 meters away through the dry earth. Strange. And beautiful. And more alive than you might think, in ways that will not be gone when the Triassic ends but will simply transform and transform again, and keep on transforming through all the ages to come. Rest now. Let the strange creatures of an ancient world move quietly through the landscape of your closing thoughts. They are not threatening. They are not coming toward you. They are simply going about their lives in the last light of a Triassic afternoon, doing what they were made to do, being exactly what they are. Alive. Here. In the endless middle of the world. The Dicynodont lineage, those mammal-like synapsids with their distinctive paired tusks, were the other great herbivore group of the Triassic alongside the Rhynchosaurs. Lystrosaurus was itself a Dicynodont, and the Dicynodont lineage showed considerable diversity in the early and middle Triassic, from small burrowing forms to the enormous Lysowitia of the late Triassic of Poland, which approached the size of a modern elephant and represents the largest non-dinosaurian land animal of the entire Triassic period. Lysowitia is a remarkable discovery, announced in 2018 from late Triassic deposits in Poland. Its existence was unexpected because the general trend in the synapsid lineage through the Triassic was towards smaller body sizes, as the mammals and their closest relatives retreated into the small animal niches. The existence of a late Triassic Dicynodont the size of an elephant suggests that the synapsid lineage was still experimenting, still pushing into large herbivore niches even as the dinosaurian sauropodomorphs were expanding into those same niches. The coexistence of Lysowitia and large sauropodomorphs in the late Triassic, if they did indeed coexist, is a fascinating ecological situation. Two entirely different lineages from entirely different branches of the vertebrate family tree, occupying similar large herbivore niches simultaneously. The outcome of this coexistence, the eventual extinction of Lysowitia and the triumph of the sauropodomorphs, was not inevitable from the inside. It required the specific conditions of the end Triassic extinction, which apparently hit the Dicynodont lineage more severely than the dinosaur lineage to resolve the competition. Among the strangest of all Triassic creatures were the Archosaurs that seemed, for a brief window of time, to be exploring bipedality independently of the dinosaur lineage. The Rawasuchians, which were primarily large quadrupedal predators, included some forms that may have been capable of at least facultative bipedality. The pop culture image of bipedal motion as a dinosaur exclusive is not entirely accurate for the Triassic. The posture was being explored by multiple lineages, and the competitive advantage it conferred was available, in principle, to any Archosaur with the right basic proportions. What ultimately determined that the dinosaurs would be the successful bipeds, and not the various non-dinosaurian Archosaurs that also experimented with upright posture, is a question that does not have a simple answer. Part of it was timing. The dinosaurs were already established in bipedal niches when the camp-driven extinction cleared the board. Part of it was physiology. The specific suite of adaptations in the dinosaur lineage, the respiratory system, the growth rate, the hip and ankle architecture, was apparently better suited to the challenges of the post-Triassic world than the equivalent systems in the Pseudosuchians. And part of it was simply the random aspect of survival, which lineages happened to have populations in the places that were least affected by the end Triassic extinctions. The randomness of survival through mass extinctions is one of the more philosophically challenging aspects of evolutionary history. We are accustomed to thinking of evolution as a process driven by competitive advantage, by the better design winning out. And this is true on the long time scale in normal conditions. But mass extinctions are not normal conditions. In a mass extinction, the criteria for survival change so rapidly and so dramatically that competitive advantage under the old conditions becomes irrelevant. What determines survival is resilience to the specific stressors of the crisis, which may have little to do with fitness under normal conditions. This is why mass extinctions are so good at reshuffling the ecological deck. The dominant species under normal conditions are often the most specialized, the most tightly fitted to their ecological roles, and therefore the least resilient to sudden change. The marginal species, less perfectly adapted to any single role, are often the most resilient, the most capable of finding something to eat in disrupted conditions, of surviving in habitats their competitors ignored, of keeping populations going on reduced resources during the crisis. The Triassic demonstrated this repeatedly. The Great Dying. The Carnian Pluvial Episode. The End Triassic Extinction. Each time the dominant groups took the greatest losses. Each time the previously marginal groups stepped into the spaces the dominant groups left behind. Each transition produced a different dominant group, because the previous dominant had been removed and the successor was drawn from whoever had been patient enough or lucky enough to survive at the margins. Patience, luck, resilience. These are the evolutionary virtues. Not spectacular adaptation, not peak performance in any single dimension, but the capacity to keep going when conditions are bad, to survive the bad times and be there when good times return. These are also, not coincidentally, the virtues most associated with the practice of sleep. The patient restoration of the body and brain during rest. The resilience that comes from adequate sleep, the immune function, the emotional regulation, the cognitive flexibility. The luck, in a sense, of waking up renewed with the resources and the clarity to face what the next day holds. The Triassic practiced these virtues for 51 million years. And they worked. Rest in that, deeply and completely, as the strange creatures of the ancient world settle around you in the dark. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Every origin has a before. Every beginning has a slow, undramatic preparation that precedes it, a long period of conditions accumulating, of small changes adding to other small changes, of the right animal in the right place slowly becoming the thing that everything after depends on. The dinosaurs are perhaps the most famous example of this in the history of life. Their rise to dominance is one of the great stories of evolutionary biology. But that story did not begin with the dinosaurs themselves. It began much earlier, in the quiet evolutionary work being done by the group that would give rise to them, the ornithodorine Archosaurs. To understand where the dinosaurs came from, you need to understand what they came from. And that means understanding the Archosaur lineage split that we touched on in the last chapter, the divergence between the Pseudosuchians on one side and the ornithodorines on the other, and what was different about each path. The Pseudosuchians, as we have established, were the dominant large animals of the Triassic. They were successful, diverse, and well adapted to the conditions of the supercontinent. Their success, however, was built on a body plan that had certain limitations that were not apparent in the Triassic world but would become critical when that world changed. The ornithodorines were doing something different. Their body plan was lighter, more energetically efficient, more oriented towards speed and agility than brute force. The ankle joint that defines the ornithodorine lineage, a specialized hinge joint called a mesotarsal ankle, gave them a more upright posture and a more efficient stride. They moved their legs straight beneath their bodies rather than with the sprawling or semi-erect posture of the Pseudosuchians, and this seemingly technical distinction turned out to be enormously significant for future evolutionary potential. The earliest members of this lineage included the Lagirpedids and the Marasuchus-like forms, small animals of the Middle Triassic that are known from fragmentary fossils but whose importance is disproportionate to their size. Lagirpetin, from the Middle Triassic of Argentina, was a small, bipedally capable animal whose ankle anatomy is clearly ornithodorine and whose overall body proportions suggest an active, fast-moving lifestyle. Its fossils are not spectacular. It was not a spectacular animal, judged by Triassic standards. But it was on the right branch of the Archosaur tree. It was going somewhere interesting. By the early late Triassic, around 235 to 230 million years ago, the first true dinosaurs had appeared. Their origin is still a subject of active research, and the exact boundary between the earliest dinosaurs and their immediate non-dinosaurian relatives is something that different paleontologists draw in slightly different places. but the broad picture is reasonably clear. The dinosaurs arose in the southern reaches of Pangea, in what is now South America, from small, bipedally capable ornithodontan ancestors, and in their earliest forms they were not dramatically different from those ancestors. The Esquigualasto Formation of Argentina is one of the most important geological formations in the world for understanding dinosaur origins. It preserves a window into a Carnian age ecosystem, perhaps 231 million years old, in conditions of extraordinary completeness for the time. The animals that lived here included Eoraptor, a small, lightly built animal about a meter long, with small teeth and grasping hands, probably an omnivore moving quickly through the undergrowth on two legs. There was Herrerasaurus, larger and more clearly a predator, with recurved teeth and a jaw mechanism that allowed it to hold struggling prey. There was Pisanosaurus, potentially one of the earliest herbivorous dinosaurs, though its affinities are disputed. These animals were not dominant in their ecosystem. The Esquigualasto Formation also contains abundant remains of rhynchosaurs, large barrel-bodied herbivores that were clearly the primary herbivores of the community, and the predatory pseudosuchians that preyed on them. Dinosaurs were a small minority of the fauna, perhaps 5 to 10% of individuals or less. They were present. They were alive. They were doing well enough to leave fossils. But they were not the story of the Esquigualasto world. Not yet. What were they doing, these first dinosaurs, that the other animals were not? The question is important because the answer tells us why they eventually succeeded when so many of their contemporaries did not. Part of the answer lies in their posture and locomotion. The fully upright, column-like stance of the dinosaur leg, with the femur dropping vertically and the tibia and fibula extending below it, is more energetically efficient than the sprawling or even semi-erect posture of many of their competitors. At rest, the dinosaur skeleton supports itself efficiently. In motion, the dinosaur stride is longer and more economical per unit of energy expended. This matters most not in sprinting, which few animals need to do very often, but in sustained movement, in the daily business of finding food and water and avoiding predators across the enormous, often featureless landscapes of the Triassic. There is also growing evidence that at least some early dinosaurs had elevated metabolisms, metabolic rates higher than typical reptiles, approaching or in some cases reaching the fully endothermic, warm-blooded condition of modern birds and mammals. The evidence for this comes from the bone microstructure of early dinosaurs, which shows rapid, continuous growth rather than the arrested, seasonally interrupted growth seen in cold-blooded animals. Fast growth requires fast metabolism. Fast metabolism, in turn, allows sustained activity in a wider range of environmental conditions. The lung architecture of the dinosaur lineage was also likely different from that of typical reptiles. Modern birds, the living dinosaurs, have a respiratory system that is radically different from mammalian lungs, a flow-through system that extracts oxygen more efficiently and allows for the high metabolic demands of powered flight. The earliest dinosaurs may not have had full avian-style air sac systems, but the skeletal evidence suggests they were moving in that direction. Hollow bones, the characteristic lightweight architecture of birds, appears in the dinosaur lineage quite early. Those hollow spaces were not just about lightness. They were likely connected to air sacs, to a respiratory system that was more efficient than that of their competitors. All of this added up to animals that were, in certain key respects, more capable than their Triassic contemporaries. Not obviously, not dramatically, not in ways that translated immediately into ecological dominance. In the Middle Triassic, the pseudosuchians were still bigger, still more numerous, still more established in the dominant ecological roles. But the dinosaur body plan was accumulating advantages. It was a better design for what the world was about to become. Because the world was about to change. The Carnian pluvial episode, which we encountered in the reference script, the 2 million years of rain, was coming. And when it came, those accumulated advantages would matter enormously. We will return to that transformation. But first, let us spend a little time in the Carnian forests and plains, in the world just before the rains, watching the early dinosaurs move through a landscape that still belongs to others. The Carnian stage of the late Triassic, roughly 237 to 227 million years ago, was a time of relative stability before the Great Upheaval. The climate was hot and dry across most of Pangea's interior, with intense seasonal monsoons along the coasts. The vegetation was dominated by seed ferns and conifers. The dominant large animals were the Aetosaur and Rhynchosaurs among herbivores, the Rauisuchians and other pseudosuchian predators among carnivores. And in this world the early dinosaurs were learning. Learning is too intentional a word, of course. Evolution does not intend. But the process that looks like learning was underway. Early dinosaur lineages were diversifying into slightly different ecological roles, each variant selecting for slightly different behaviors, body proportions, diets. Some were becoming more committed carnivores. Others were experimenting with herbivory, that enormously productive lifestyle that allows an animal to access the most abundant food source in any terrestrial ecosystem, the plants. The bipedal, upright body plan was proving flexible enough to support both. The diversity of early dinosaurs may seem modest compared to what would come later. But in the context of the Carnian world, the rate at which dinosaur diversity was increasing was already notable. Each generation that survived added something, changed something slightly, created a variant that could go somewhere new or eat something different. The cumulative effect of this, across thousands and tens of thousands of generations, was the beginning of the most spectacular evolutionary radiation in the history of land vertebrates. The early dinosaurs did not know they were ancestors. They did not know that their descendants would include animals weighing 80 tons, that they would eventually develop feathers and flight, that they would persist for 165 million years and leave living representatives still walking and flying in every environment on the modern Earth. They were simply alive in the Carnian, small and fast and warm and energetic, doing what every living thing does. Surviving, eating, reproducing, disappearing into the undergrowth when something larger came near. Let yourself slow down into that simplicity. All of the complexity of the Triassic world, the changing climate and the shifting continent and the recovering oceans and the evolving ecosystems, it all reduces at the level of individual experience to something much more immediate and quiet. A warm body in the sun. The smell of resin in dry air. The taste of a small lizard. The cooling that comes with evening. The instinctive stillness when something large moves in the trees. These were the dinosaurs at the very beginning. Not kings. Not giants. Just alive, in the afternoon of a world that was about to change around them in ways that would eventually make them everything. Close your eyes a little further. The Carnian afternoon is warm. The conifer shadows are long. Somewhere, something small and warm-blooded is watching from the shadows. Something that has no name yet, in any language, because the language and the name will not exist for 230 million years. But it is watching. It is there. And it is waiting for rain. The Carnian forests of South America are preserved in extraordinary detail in certain formations. The Santa Maria Formation of southern Brazil, which spans the late Carnian and early Norean, contains fossils of both the earliest dinosaurs and the animals they were replacing, a snapshot of a world in transition. Walking through the paleo landscape that this formation records would be walking through a world where the old order and the new order coexisted, where the Archosaurs and Rhynchosaurs that had dominated were beginning to share their landscape with increasing numbers of the small, fast, bipedal dinosaurs that would eventually replace them. The Santa Maria fauna is dominated, in terms of sheer numbers of individuals, by Rhynchosaurs. These pig-sized to small cow-sized herbivores, with their chisel-like beaks for cropping vegetation and their robust bodies built for bulk processing of plant material, were clearly the primary herbivores of this ecosystem. They were common. Their fossils are everywhere in the formation. A Rhynchosaur herd moving through the Carnian landscape of what is now southern Brazil would have been the most conspicuous animal community visible, dozens or hundreds of individuals spread across the floodplain, heads down, cropping the abundant ferns and seed ferns that grew near the river channels. Hunting them were the predatory pseudosuchians and, increasingly, the first theropod dinosaurs. Storikosaurus, one of the earliest known theropods from the Santa Maria Formation, was a bipedal predator about 2 meters long, light and fast by the standards of its time, probably capable of running down smaller Rhynchosaurs or the juveniles of larger ones. Its skeleton was lightly built, its legs long relative to its body, its skull narrow and its teeth recurved, good for holding and cutting through flesh. The relationship between Storikosaurus and the Rhynchosaurs it hunted was one of the foundational predator-prey relationships of the early dinosaur world. It was not yet the relationship between Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops, not yet the defining confrontation of the Age of Giants. It was something more modest, more quiet, a small predator and a medium-sized prey animal navigating a floodplain landscape that had been shaped by millions of years of different animals playing similar roles. But the relationship was the beginning of something. The dynamic between bipedal theropod predators and their herbivore prey would develop and elaborate and intensify over the next 160 million years into some of the most remarkable ecological relationships the world has ever seen. The fact that we can trace this trajectory so clearly, from the small theropod of the Santa Maria Formation to the enormous theropods of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, is one of the great achievements of modern paleontology. The fossil record is not complete. It never is. There are gaps, sometimes large ones, where the rock was not preserved or has not been found. But the gaps are getting smaller with every field season, with every new discovery, and the broad picture is clear enough that we can describe the trajectory with confidence. The trajectory goes small and then larger, marginal and then dominant, experimental and then established. The Triassic dinosaurs were the experiment. The Jurassic dinosaurs were the answer. The experiment was only possible because the world was in the state it was in, recovering from the Great Dying, being disrupted by the Carnian pluvial episode, being opened up by the fracturing of Pangea, being emptied and refilled and emptied again by the sequence of crises that characterizes the Triassic period. And in all of this, in the forest margins and the floodplain edges and the riverbank undergrowth, the early dinosaurs were present, watching, adapting, taking their opportunities, building towards something that would eventually fill the world. The Carnian afternoon is long. The shadows of the conifer trees are lengthening, reaching across the red floodplain mud toward the river channel where the Storchosaurus is drinking. A rhynchosaur, a large adult female, lifts her head from the vegetation and watches the small predator with wary eyes. Her body language communicates nothing readable in human terms. She is simply a large herbivore watching a predator, assessing the risk, determining whether continued feeding is safe or whether this requires attention. The predator drinks, moves away. The rhynchosaur drops her head again and continues feeding. This is life in the Carnian. Not dramatic. Not the thundering confrontations of the late Cretaceous or the towering giants of the Jurassic. Just animals going about their lives in a world that is quietly, gradually becoming something new. Let the quiet of that ancient afternoon come over you now. The long shadows. The sound of the river. The smell of resin and warm mud. The distant sound of something large moving through vegetation. Everything is settling. As it always does at the end of the day. As you are settling now. The rain came. 2 million years of it, as we have discussed, as you may remember from the story that preceded this one if you have been listening to this channel for any time at all. The Carnian pluvial episode transformed the world of the late Triassic in ways that were catastrophic for the established order and generative for everything that came after. The great Pseudosuchian predators struggled. The dominant herbivores declined. The carefully calibrated ecosystems of the dry Carnian world were disrupted, their constituent species displaced or extinct, their ecological niches suddenly empty. And into those empty niches the dinosaurs moved. We have already talked about why this happened. The energetic efficiency of the dinosaur locomotor system, the possibility of elevated metabolism, the generalist diets that allowed flexibility when specific food sources disappeared. But there is another factor that deserves attention, one that is perhaps less mechanistic and more about the particular nature of the Carnian world and how the dinosaur body plan fitted it. The world created by the Carnian pluvial episode was a world of new habitats, of wetlands and river systems and lake margins and flooded forest floors that had not existed in significant extent before the rains began. These were complex, structurally varied habitats, with dense vegetation creating obstacles that sprawling animals found difficult to navigate efficiently. The fully upright dinosaur body plan, the legs directly beneath the center of gravity, the long striding gait, was well suited to this kind of terrain. Moving through dense, waterlogged vegetation is much easier when you walk tall, when you can step over obstacles rather than having to navigate around them, when your body is elevated enough that the substrate does not create constant resistance. The early herbivorous dinosaurs were also developing something that was rare among the large Triassic animals: social behavior. The first large herbivorous dinosaurs, the sauropodomorphs, may have moved in groups, may have engaged in the kind of herd behavior that modern large herbivores use to reduce predation risk. There is fossil evidence, not conclusive but suggestive, that some early dinosaurs nested communally, that multiple individuals gathered at the same sites to lay eggs, creating a kind of colonial breeding structure. If this is correct, it has significant implications for the social lives of these animals, for the ways they perceived and interacted with their environment, for the degree of parental investment they may have made in their offspring. The sauropodomorph lineage is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the most extraordinary success stories in the history of vertebrate life. The sauropods, the great long-necked, long-tailed, four-legged herbivores that would become the largest land animals in Earth's history, began as relatively modest bipedal animals in the late Triassic. Their early representatives, forms like Plateosaurus from the Norian of Europe and Thecodontosaurus from the Rhaetian of Britain, were animals of perhaps 3 to 8 meters in length, capable of rising on their hind legs to reach high vegetation, their small heads equipped with leaf-shaped teeth for processing plant material. Plateosaurus is one of the best understood early dinosaurs, largely because it is extraordinarily abundant in the Triassic deposits of Central Europe. Hundreds of specimens have been collected from the German Kuper, the late Triassic red beds of Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, sometimes in what appear to be mass death assemblages, groups of individuals preserved together in circumstances that suggest they died at approximately the same time, perhaps during a drought when a drying river or lake concentrated animals at a shrinking water source. The sheer abundance of Plateosaurus fossils tells us this was a successful common animal, distributed widely across its habitat. Plateosaurus was not small. Adult individuals reached 7 to 8 meters, weighing perhaps 3 to 4 tons. This was already substantially larger than the dominant synapsid herbivores of the Permian, and the sauropodomorph lineage was just beginning. The trajectory of body size increase in this group, from the modest Plateosaurus of the Norian to the gigantic Brachiosaurus of the Jurassic, which reached over 26 meters and may have weighed 50 to 60 tons, is one of the most dramatic size increase trends in the fossil record. Why did the sauropodomorphs get so large? The question has occupied paleontologists for decades. Part of the answer involves feeding ecology. Large browsers that can reach high vegetation have access to food that smaller animals cannot obtain. A tall, large-bodied herbivore can exploit the upper canopy of a forest, which represents an enormous quantity of food that is effectively inaccessible to animals below a certain height. The neck, which became increasingly long and elaborate in the sauropod lineage, was the key adaptation here, a device for extending the reach of the animal without requiring it to expend energy climbing. But size itself has consequences beyond feeding. Large body size reduces vulnerability to predators, since most predators have an upper limit to the size of prey they can effectively attack. Large body size in a warm environment is thermodynamically advantageous because large bodies lose heat more slowly, and for a large animal maintaining body temperature in a warm climate requires less metabolic effort. Large body size allows access to food resources spread over enormous geographic areas, since large animals can travel further for less energetic cost per unit of body weight than small animals. The early theropods, the predatory dinosaur lineage, were also diversifying rapidly in the Norian and Rhaetian stages of the late Triassic, the period immediately following the Carnian pluvial episode. Forms like Coelophysis from the late Triassic of New Mexico are among the best documented early theropods. The Ghost Ranch Coelophysis quarry, discovered in 1947, produced over 1,000 specimens of this animal, an extraordinary accumulation that suggests some kind of mass death event, perhaps a flash flood that killed an enormous population gathered at a drying water source. Coelophysis was a slender, lightly built predator about 3 meters long, running on 2 legs with a long flexible neck, small arms equipped with grasping hands, and a skull that was almost entirely openings and thin struts of bone, lightweight and strong simultaneously. Its teeth were small and recurved, perfect for catching small prey. Its general build suggests it was a fast, agile hunter, probably pursuing lizards, early mammals, and small dinosaurs through the open woodland habitat of the Triassic American Southwest. The abundance of Coelophysis in the Ghost Ranch quarry gives us something rare in paleontology, a glimpse of population-level biology. These animals were clearly not solitary. They were around each other in large numbers. Some specimens show evidence of sexual dimorphism, differences between males and females in body proportions, which implies the kind of mate selection and social dynamics that would not be out of place in a modern population of social reptiles. Some Ghost Ranch specimens also preserve the bones of smaller Coelophysis individuals inside the body cavity of larger ones. When this was first reported, it was interpreted as evidence of cannibalism, of adults eating juveniles of their own species. More recent analysis has been less certain about this interpretation, suggesting the smaller bones might represent prey items of other species rather than conspecifics. But the possibility of cannibalism in early dinosaurs, while unsettling, is not inherently implausible. Many modern animals engage in cannibalism under stress conditions, and the late Triassic, with its recurring droughts and food shortages, would have provided plenty of stress. The world of the Norian and Rhaetian, the last 2 stages of the Triassic, roughly 227 to 201 million years ago, was a world in transition. The Carnian pluvial episode was over. The climate had shifted back toward drier conditions across much of Pangea. But the ecological structure of the world had changed permanently. The great Pseudosuchian herbivores, the Rhynchosaurs and Aetosaur, were gone or greatly reduced. The large Rauisuchian predators were in decline. And the dinosaurs, which had used the ecological upheaval of the Carnian to diversify and spread, were now established across the supercontinent. They were not yet the giants. Plateosaurus was large but not enormous. Coelophysis was fast but not terrifying. The truly enormous dinosaurs, the animals that would shake the ground and darken the sky and become the most immediately recognizable symbols of ancient life, those were still millions of years in the future. But the lineages that would give rise to them existed. The sauropodomorphs were present and diversifying. The theropods were present and diversifying. The ornithischians, the third great dinosaur lineage that would eventually give rise to the horned dinosaurs, the armored dinosaurs and the duck-billed dinosaurs, were beginning to appear in the fossil record. The stage was set. The actors were in position. The Triassic was drawing to its close, and the age of the great dinosaurs was preparing to begin. Feel the scale of that transition as you rest. The world shifting again as it always shifts, as it has been shifting for 4.5 billion years. The animals that are nobody today becoming the rulers of tomorrow. The small theropod picking through the leaf litter in the late Triassic forest, no heavier than a large dog, becoming, through the patient accumulation of millions of generations of slight variation, Tyrannosaurus rex. The modest sauropodomorph browsing in the Norian woodlands of Europe becoming Brachiosaurus, whose footsteps shook the ground and whose shadow blocked the sun. These transformations take so long that no individual can witness them. But they happen. They are happening right now in every ecosystem on Earth, in every population of every species, the slow, patient, inexorable accumulation of change that drives the history of life. You are part of this process. Your lineage is being shaped right now, as it has been shaped for every generation since life began, by the forces of selection, of mutation, of environmental pressure and opportunity. You are not the endpoint of anything. You are a moment in a story that continues. That thought, if you let it be a gentle thought rather than an anxious one, is one of the most calming things available to a human consciousness. You are temporary. Everything is temporary. The Triassic lasted 51 million years and then it was over and something else began. Whatever you are worrying about and whatever part of your mind is still active, it too will pass. It too is temporary like everything else, like the Rauisuchians and the Rhynchosaurs and the warm Carnian afternoons. Rest in impermanence. It is, after all, the nature of everything. The Ghost Ranch Quarry in New Mexico, where so many Coelophysis specimens were found, is one of the most evocative fossil sites in the world. The location itself, in the high desert of northern New Mexico where the land is red and dramatic and the sky is enormous, seems appropriate for these animals. The Chinle Formation that preserves them was deposited in a landscape that was, in some respects, not entirely unlike the modern landscape of the American Southwest. Semi-arid, with seasonal rivers and scattered forest, dominated by reds and oranges in the exposed rock. Standing at Ghost Ranch on a clear desert day, with the red mesas in the distance and the dry air sharp with the smell of sage, it is possible to imagine the Coelophysis moving through this landscape 220 million years ago. Not through this landscape exactly, of course. The Triassic Chinle was more forested and had different plants and the rivers ran differently and the climate was warmer. But the quality of light, the scale of the land, the sense of enormous time written in stratified rock, these feel connected to the fossil world in a way that is more immediate than academic. The Chinle Formation is also famous for something beyond Coelophysis. It contains some of the oldest known diversified dinosaur fauna in North America. By the time of the Chinle, dinosaurs were not just present but genuinely diverse. Theropods like Coelophysis and smaller relative Dromaeosaurine. Early sauropodomorphs like Shindosaurus. Possibly early ornithischians, though the evidence for these in the Chinle is fragmentary and debated. The fauna was complex enough that different dinosaur species were filling different ecological roles, different dietary niches, different size classes. The plant-eating dinosaurs of the Chinle period were not yet the enormous sauropods of the Jurassic. They were more modest animals, bipedal or facultatively bipedal, with smaller bodies and less specialized digestive systems. But they were herbivores. They were accessing plant material and processing it into dinosaur flesh. And in a world where the dominant herbivores, the Rhynchosaurs and Archosaurs, were beginning to decline, the space for dinosaurian herbivores was opening. The ecological transition from Rhynchosaur dominance to dinosaur dominance in the herbivore niches happened gradually, over millions of years, and its exact mechanisms are still being worked out. There does not appear to have been a single dramatic competitive displacement event where the dinosaurs outcompete and replace the Rhynchosaurs. The Rhynchosaurs declined, for reasons that may have included the climate changes associated with the Carnian pluvial episode, and the dinosaurs spread into the ecological space their decline created. The result was the same, but the mechanism was more passive, more opportunistic than direct competition. The late Triassic was full of these patterns of passive ecological succession, of one group declining and another filling the space. Evolution does not generally produce the drama of direct competition and conquest, though it can. More often it produces the quiet drama of opportunity taken and space filled, of animals doing what they do and finding, gradually, that there is more room to do it than there used to be. The theropods were the great opportunity takers of the late Triassic. As pseudosuchian predators declined or went extinct, the theropod body plan proved adaptable enough to fill the vacated niches. Some theropod lineages grew larger, developing the robust skulls and powerful jaw musculature to tackle larger prey. Others became more specialized insectivores or omnivores. Still others, in the very late Triassic and earliest Jurassic, were beginning the experiments with diet and body size that would eventually produce the enormous tyrannosaurs and allosaurs of the later Mesozoic. The trajectory from Coelophysis to Tyrannosaurus rex spans approximately 150 million years. It is not a straight line. It branches and diverges and explores many dead ends. Some lineages that looked promising in the late Triassic went extinct at the end of the period. Others survived and diversified. The exact phylogenetic relationships between all the various Triassic and Jurassic theropod groups are still being worked out, and different analyses produce somewhat different family trees. But the broad picture is clear. The theropods of the late Triassic were the ancestors of the great predatory dinosaurs of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, and the patterns of body plan and ecology that those later animals elaborated were already present in outline in the late Triassic. This is the nature of evolutionary inheritance. Not the passing on of specific traits but the passing on of potential. The Coelophysis body plan contained, in its general architecture, the potential for Tyrannosaurus rex. Not as a blueprint. Not as a destiny. Simply as a set of structural options that could, given the right environmental pressures and the right sequence of mutations across enough generations, eventually produce an animal 10 meters long and 3 tons in weight with a skull that could close with more force than any other land predator in history. The potential was there. The world would eventually call it forth. As you rest now, as your own extraordinary nervous system moves through its nightly cycle of consolidation and repair and renewal, the potential you carry is also present. Not predetermined, not fixed, but present. The capabilities you have and the ones you are still developing, the connections being made and the ones being released, all of it happening in the quiet of sleep, in the biology that has been doing this work for 200 million years without needing to be directed. Trust it. The dinosaur brain that became the bird brain that became the mammal brain and eventually the human brain knows how to do this. It has known how for a very long time. Let it work. Chapter 8. The Late Triassic, a world on the edge of something new. The late Triassic had a particular quality that is difficult to describe in simple terms. It was a time of establishment. Of things becoming what they would be for millions of years to come. The Carnian upheaval had rearranged the pieces, and now the pieces were settling into new configurations, new communities, new relationships between species that had not previously interacted. The world was stabilizing but not into the old pattern, into something new. You can hear the difference in the fossil record if you know how to listen to it. In the earliest Triassic, the fossils are sparse and repetitive, the same few species appearing again and again, the hallmark of a disaster fauna. In the Middle Triassic, the diversity increases, the communities become more structured, but there is still something tentative about it, still the quality of a world feeling its way forward. But in the Norian, the long middle stage of the late Triassic, something changes. The communities become richer. The ecological relationships become more complex. The fossils show a world that has found some of its footing. The Norian stage lasted approximately 25 million years, from roughly 227 to about 202 million years ago. That is an enormous span of time. 25 million years ago in our own history, the world was well into the Miocene, the age when the great grasslands were spreading and the ancestors of modern horses, elephants and apes were establishing themselves. 25 million years is enough time for continents to drift hundreds of kilometers, for mountain ranges to rise significantly, for entirely new groups of organisms to evolve and spread and in some cases go extinct. The Norian was not a moment. It was an age within an age. During the Norian, the Pangean continent was continuing its slow breakup. The rift systems that had been developing since the Middle Triassic were deepening and widening. Small seaways were beginning to penetrate inland from the coasts. The geography was becoming more complex, more varied, creating more isolated populations, more opportunities for evolutionary divergence. The Tethys Ocean was widening on its western end, the region that would eventually become the Atlantic beginning to form as a narrow, shallow seaway between what would become North America and what would become Europe and Africa. This developing geography had profound effects on the animals. Species that had been able to move freely across Pangea when it was fully connected found themselves increasingly separated by seaways and rifts and changing climate zones. Populations that had been in contact diverged. New species formed. The diversity of late Triassic life was, in part, a product of this increasing geographical complexity. The dinosaurs were spreading. From their apparent southern origins in what is now South America, they had moved north and east across Pangea during the Carnian, following the ecological opportunities created by the pluvial episode. By the Norian, dinosaurs were present on every part of the supercontinent. Their fossils appear in the Chinle Formation of the American Southwest, in the Kuiper beds of Europe, in the Malari Formation of India, in the Esquigualasto and Los Colorados formations of South America, in various African formations. The pattern of distribution tells a story of rapid spread, of animals that were capable of moving across the vast continental landmass in relatively short geological time. The North American Late Triassic, as revealed by the extraordinary fossil deposits of the Chinle Formation, was a particularly rich world. The Chinle Formation preserves a tropical or subtropical floodplain environment, with rivers and lakes and extensive floodplains covered in dense vegetation. The famous Petrified Forest of Arizona is part of the Chinle, and the logs preserved there, now turned to silica and minerals but retaining the exact structure of the original, would give us a direct physical connection to the trees that grew in this world. These were Araucarioxylon arizonicum, early relatives of the monkey puzzle tree, growing in dense forests along the Chinle rivers, their trunks reaching 30 meters or more, their upper canopy completely lost to time but implied by the massive bases. In the Chinle world, the dinosaurs were part of a diverse community. The Archosaurs were still present here, their armored backs cutting through the undergrowth, their fossils common in the formation. Phytosaurs, large semi-aquatic predators that looked remarkably like crocodilians but were not closely related, patrolled the rivers and lake margins, their long snouts and high-set nostrils almost identical to modern gharials in overall design, evidence of convergent evolution toward an efficient fish-catching body plan. The theropod dinosaur Coelophysis was present in abundance. Herbivorous dinosaurs, early sauropodomorphs, grazed on the vegetation. And the small, warm-blooded cynodonts that would give rise to true mammals were there too, living in burrows or under debris, emerging at night when the large predators were less active. The Chinle ecosystem was not dominated by dinosaurs. Not yet. The phytosaurs and Archosaur and Rawasuchian predators were still significant components of the fauna. But the trajectory was visible. Dinosaur diversity was higher than that of any other large vertebrate group. Dinosaur body sizes were increasing. Dinosaur geographic range was expanding. Every decade that passed, in the deep time sense of decades, saw the dinosaurs a little more established, a little more central to the functioning of the ecosystems they inhabited. The forests of the Norian deserve special attention, because they shaped the world that dinosaurs were learning to live in. The great seed fern forests that had dominated the early Triassic were largely gone, replaced by conifer-dominated communities that were more resilient to the increasingly seasonal climate of the late Triassic. These were not forests like modern tropical rainforests. They were drier, more open, more seasonal in their growth patterns. The trees grew quickly when rain was available and maintained themselves during dry periods, their resinous, drought-adapted needles reducing water loss. The forest floor was carpeted with ferns and early cycads, plants that could handle the fluctuating moisture conditions. The canopy was dominated by conifers that, in some cases, grew to enormous size. The ecological structure of these forests was not as complex as that of modern forests, where millions of years of coevolution have created intricate relationships between plants and their pollinators, seed dispersers, herbivores, and parasites. The Triassic forests were simpler in their ecological architecture. But they were productive. They were spreading. And they were providing the habitat that the large herbivorous dinosaurs needed to begin their own expansion. The sauropodomorphs, those early relatives of the great sauropods, were exploiting the conifer forests in ways that their immediate predecessors had not. Their long necks, already somewhat elongated compared to the relatively short-necked condition of the earliest dinosaurs, gave them access to the middle and upper canopy. They were tall enough and long enough to reach vegetation that was simply inaccessible to the Rhynchosaurs and Archosaur they had replaced. This height advantage, which would become more and more pronounced as the sauropod lineage evolved, was one of the fundamental competitive advantages of the dinosaur herbivore design. The oceans of the Norian were also changing, continuing the recovery that had been underway since the early Triassic. The ichthyosaur fauna of the late Triassic included some of the largest marine animals that had yet existed. The Shastasaurid ichthyosaurs, Those enormous animals from what is now Nevada and British Columbia reached sizes that may have exceeded 20 meters, and their lifestyle, as inferred from their body proportions and the environments in which their fossils are found, was probably similar to that of modern sperm whales. Deep diving, pursuit predators that fed on cephalopods and large fish in the mesopelagic zone of the ocean. The first plesiosaurs were also appearing in the Norian, transitional forms that show the initial stages of the full aquatic adaptation that would characterize the group throughout the Jurassic and Cretaceous. Pistosaurus, one of the better-known transitional forms, had longer limbs and a more robust body than the Nothosaurs, and its neck was becoming longer, developing the characteristic extension that would reach its extreme expression in forms like Elasmosaurus of the Cretaceous, an animal whose neck was longer than its body and tail combined. Flying above all of this, the pterosaurs were establishing themselves as the masters of the Triassic era. The earliest pterosaurs are known from the Norian, and they were already remarkably capable flyers. Eudomorphodon from the late Triassic of Italy had a wingspan of about 1 meter, complex multicusped teeth suggesting a diet of fish, and all the skeletal features of a fully competent powered flyer. Its wrist structure, the arrangement of flight bones, the attachment points for flight muscles, these are all fully developed, suggesting that the pterosaur lineage had already been flying for some time before the earliest known fossils, that the transition to flight had happened earlier and left no record, or had happened rapidly enough that we have not yet found the intermediate forms. Pterosaur flight was different from bird flight in important ways. The wing membrane, the patagium, was supported by an enormously elongated fourth finger and stretched between this finger and the hind limb, creating a large wing surface with different aerodynamic properties from the feathered wing of birds. The bodies of pterosaurs were covered not with scales but with pycnofibers, filamentous integumentary structures that may have provided insulation and aerodynamic control. They were warm-blooded, certainly, because the energetic demands of powered flight are too great for an ectotherm to meet. They were, in their own way, as fully realized and capable as any flying animal that has ever existed. The insects had diversified enormously by the Norian, filling the air with a diversity of forms that provided food for both the pterosaurs above and the small terrestrial animals below. Beetles were present in quantity. True flies were establishing themselves as the great recyclers of the organic world. Various plant-eating insect groups were tracking the diversification of the plant communities, developing relationships with specific plant species that would, eventually, over millions of years of coevolution, produce the extraordinary partnerships between insects and flowers that would define the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic. This is the late Triassic world in all its complexity. A world that is clearly different from what came before, that has moved far beyond the emptiness and simplicity of the early Triassic disaster fauna. A world with deep forests and shallow seas and flying reptiles in the sky and enormous plant-eating dinosaurs beginning to push through the forest margins and small warm-blooded mammals in the undergrowth. A world that is, in some sense, proto-Mesozoic, a preview of the age of the great dinosaurs, still incomplete, still in process, but unmistakably headed somewhere extraordinary. The Norian nights were warm. The stars, looking up through a gap in the conifer canopy, were the same stars as our stars, largely in different positions as the Earth's rotation axis has shifted over time, but the same stars. The Milky Way stretched overhead. Meteors occasionally crossed the dark. Somewhere below, the cynodont in its burrow was hearing the night through its increasingly sophisticated ear. The sauropodomorph in the clearing was breathing slowly, its vast body cooling slightly in the night air, its eyes open, watching, its awareness of the world dimmer and less conceptual than ours but present, immediate, real. Life in the Norian was as fully alive as life in any other moment. As real, as immediate, as complete in its experience of its own existence. The quality of being alive does not increase over time. A Triassic cynodont was not less alive than you are. A Norian conifer was not less real than the trees you have known. They were here. They were now. They had their moment as all things have their moment. And now, in the dark and the quiet of your own moment, you can let them rest. Let the Norian nights come down around you. Let the stars move overhead as they always have. Let the warm breathing of ancient animals fill the space behind your closed eyes with something that is neither memory nor imagination but something older than either. Sleep is close. The cynodont in its burrow was not thinking about the future. It could not. But its body was already carrying the future inside it, in the refined structure of its jaw and ear, in the insulating layer of fine fur that kept it warm through the Norian nights, in the complex chemistry of its milk and the instincts that directed it toward its young with something that looked, from the outside, very much like tenderness. Evolution does not plan. But sometimes the result of its blind process is something that looks, in retrospect, almost as if it were intended. The great sauropodomorphs resting in the clearings of the late Triassic world had their own kind of future written inside them. Those early plesiosaurs and their relatives, broad-footed, long-necked, already beginning to grow larger than any land animal had been since the synapsid giants of the Permian, were carrying the blueprint for the colossal sauropods of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. The trend toward size had begun. The architecture of the vertebral column, the pneumatized bones lightened by air sacs connected to a bird-like respiratory system, the crushing dental batteries that would eventually process tons of vegetation per day, all of this was in early draft form in the sauropodomorphs of the Norian. It would take another 50 million years and more to reach its full expression, but the direction was already set. Forests in the Norian were becoming richer, more structurally complex. The canopy layer, the middle layer, and the ground layer were differentiating as they do in all mature forest ecosystems, creating a vertical zonation of habitats that different species could specialize for. Canopy dwellers, understory specialists, ground-level foragers. Each layer was its own community, its own food web, its own set of evolutionary pressures. The small early mammals occupied primarily the ground layer and perhaps the lower branches of shrubs and small trees. The pterosaurs owned the canopy and the sky. The dinosaurs ranged from ground level to the heights of the tallest conifers, depending on their size and feeding strategy. Rain still fell, though nothing like the deluges of the Carnian. The Norian climate was, by the standards of what came before, relatively stable. Seasonal monsoons brought rain to the coastal margins of the fragmenting Pangea. Inland regions remained dry. The interiors of the large landmasses, which were beginning to feel the first very early symptoms of continental separation, were still warm and arid. But the variety of climate zones across the late Triassic world was greater than it had been in the early Triassic, and that variety was one of the engines of diversity. The end of the Triassic was still to come. The great extinction at the boundary between Triassic and Jurassic, approximately 201 million years ago, would reset much of what had been built. Another pulse of massive volcanism, this time from the central Atlantic magmatic province as Pangea finally began to crack open, would flood the atmosphere with carbon dioxide again, would collapse ecosystems once more, would drive a new wave of extinctions. The cruratarsans, the crocodile-line archosaurs that had remained competitive with the dinosaurs throughout the Triassic, would be largely eliminated. Marine ecosystems would suffer badly. But the dinosaurs would survive. The dinosaurs and the pterosaurs, and the small cynodont descendants already becoming the first true mammals, these would cross the boundary intact. They would cross into the Jurassic world, which waited on the other side of the extinction like a new continent discovered from the bow of a ship. A world that was, in many ways, a continuation and elaboration of everything the Triassic had built. But also something genuinely new, something that could not have been predicted from the Triassic alone. The late Triassic world, for all its richness, was a world in transition. A world that did not yet know what it was becoming. Every ecosystem it contained, every species, every relationship between predator and prey and parasite and host, was a draft, an experiment, a step in a process whose destination lay far ahead in time. The full flowering of the Mesozoic was still tens of millions of years away. But the foundation was here. Laid down carefully over 50 million years of recovery and experiment, in red rock deserts and humid coastal forests and warm shallow seas. The Triassic world had done its work. It had taken the emptiness left by the greatest extinction in Earth's history and built something extraordinary from it. Rest now. The Norian is settling into quiet. The great work of building a new world is, for this moment, complete. All ages end. This is the only truly consistent fact about geological time. The boundaries between one period and another, between one age and the next, are not arbitrary lines drawn by scientists on a timeline for administrative convenience. They are real boundaries documented in the rock, marked by genuine changes in the composition of life, by extinctions and radiations and the physical signatures of events large enough to alter the course of the living world. The end of the Triassic was one of these real boundaries. And it was not gentle. 201 million years ago, give or take a few 100,000 years, the world ended again. Not as completely as the Great Dying. Not with the apocalyptic totality that had characterized the Permian-Triassic boundary. But significantly. Catastrophically. In ways that would once again clear the board, eliminate the dominant players and make room for something new. The end-Triassic extinction, as it is formally known, killed approximately 3/4 of all species on Earth. In the oceans, the major marine reptile groups of the late Triassic declined or disappeared, the great ichthyosaurs reduced in diversity, the nothosaurs gone entirely, the marine food webs restructured by the loss of key species. Ammonoids, which had diversified so spectacularly through the Triassic, were hit hard again, their diversity crashing back toward the kind of narrow survival they had experienced in the aftermath of the Permian extinction. On land, most of the non-dinosaurian Archosaurs went extinct, the Aetosaur and Phytosaurs and most Rawasuchians disappearing from the fossil record. The prosauropods, those early sauropodomorphs, declined sharply in diversity at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. And the cause was again volcanic. Again, the largest fires in the world were lit by geological forces operating in the deep interior of the Earth. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP, was the volcanic system that drove the end Triassic extinction. It erupted in association with the actual rifting of Pangea, the moment when the crust finally tore and the first genuine seaways began to open between North America and Africa and between North America and Europe. The rifting was accompanied by enormous outpourings of basalt lava, sheets of molten rock that covered an area larger than the lower 48 states of America in layers up to a kilometer thick. The camp eruptions were among the largest volcanic events in the last 500 million years, and like the Siberian traps before them, they pumped enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The sequence of events is now well documented from studies of the carbon isotope record in the rocks. There were multiple pulses of volcanic activity, each pulse injecting CO2 into the atmosphere, warming the planet, acidifying the oceans, disrupting the atmospheric chemistry that life depended on. The ecological consequences of each pulse rippled through food webs and ecosystems in cascading waves of secondary and tertiary effects. Predators that depended on now extinct prey. Herbivores that had specialized on now dead plant communities. The entire structure of ecological relationships, which had been slowly and painfully built up over the 50 million years of the Triassic recovery, unraveled again. But here is the thing about the end Triassic extinction, the thing that distinguishes it from the Great Dying and gives it a very different character in the history of life. Some groups were barely affected. And the groups that were barely affected were, without exception, the groups that were about to inherit the Jurassic world. The dinosaurs sailed through the end Triassic extinction with relatively minor losses. The exact number of dinosaur species that went extinct at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary is uncertain and debated, but the evidence strongly suggests that dinosaur diversity was not dramatically reduced. The major dinosaur lineages that had established themselves in the late Triassic were still present at the beginning of the Jurassic. The sauropodomorphs were still there. The theropods were still there. The ornithischians, though relatively rare and poorly diversified in the latest Triassic, were still there. Why did the dinosaurs survive when so many others did not? The answer is probably related to those same physiological and ecological features that had allowed them to thrive after the Carnian pluvial episode. Their elevated metabolisms made them less sensitive to the temperature disruptions caused by volcanic aerosols. Their tendency toward omnivory or feeding flexibility allowed them to shift diets when preferred food sources disappeared. Their respiratory efficiency, that developing air sac system, helped them cope with the oxygen fluctuations associated with massive volcanic activity. And their generally rapid growth and relatively fast reproductive rates, compared to the large pseudosuchian archosaurs, allowed populations to recover more quickly from local die-offs. The mammals also survived, though in reduced diversity. The early true mammals, which had finally diverged fully from the cynodont synapsids by the earliest Jurassic, were small, insectivorous animals, too small to be heavily affected by changes in large animal communities, too versatile in their diets to be wiped out by the extinction of any single prey species. They tucked into the same refuges that had sheltered small, adaptable animals through every previous crisis, and they waited. As the camp eruptions gradually quieted, as the worst of the environmental disruption faded, as the planet began once again to stabilize at a new climatic baseline, the stage was set for the most famous phase of Earth's biological history. The Jurassic was beginning. The Jurassic. The age of the great sauropods and the fierce theropods and the elaborate armored ankylosaurs and the first birds, the feathered descendants of the theropod lineage that would eventually come to dominate the skies. The age when Pangea finally fractured fully, when the Atlantic Ocean opened and the world began to acquire the basic geography we recognize today. The age when global temperatures were warm, when polar ice caps did not exist, when tropical forests extended into high latitudes and the whole planet breathed with a warmth and productivity that supported the largest land animals in the history of life. The dinosaurs did not walk into the Jurassic. They did not consciously cross a boundary or take advantage of an opportunity. They simply survived, and in surviving found themselves in a world that their ancestors had helped to shape and that was now, with the departure of their major competitors, entirely theirs. The door between the Triassic and the Jurassic is one of the most significant thresholds in the history of land life. On one side, a world of diverse, competing animal groups, dinosaurs present but not dominant, the ecological hierarchy still uncertain. On the other side, the age of the dinosaurs fully established, the most successful large land animals in the history of the planet, in every habitat on every continent for 135 million years. Through that door walked Brachiosaurus and Diplodocus and Stegosaurus and Allosaurus and eventually much later Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops and Velociraptor. Through that door walked the ancestors of every bird that has ever flown, every species that will ever fly through that door and through no other. Feel the weight of that threshold as you rest. 201 million years ago, a door opened. Nothing that crossed it knew they were crossing anything. They were simply alive as they had always been alive, moving through their world as animals move through their world. But in crossing it, they stepped from one age into another, from the world that had been into the world that would be, from the Triassic into everything that followed. Everything includes us. The mammals that emerged from the Triassic shadows, the small warm-blooded survivors of the Great Dying and the end-Triassic extinction, the cynodonts and their descendants, they too crossed that threshold. They too lived in the shadow of the dinosaurs throughout the Jurassic and Cretaceous. And when the dinosaurs finally fell 66 million years ago, those small, persistent, warm-blooded, insect-eating mammals were still there, still alive, and the world was theirs at last. And here you are, at the end of that chain. In the dark, breathing slowly. The Triassic is behind you, 200 million years behind you, a world of red rock and shallow seas and small dinosaurs and armored Archosaur and tiny warm-blooded ancestors that were also your ancestors. It is impossibly far away. And yet here it is, in your bones and your metabolism and your differentiated teeth and your warm blood and your complex, listening ear. Here it is, in the living mammal that you are, carrying within you the inheritance of everything that survived. The door is open. You have already crossed it. You are already in the world on the other side. Rest in that. The rocks remember. That is the thing about geology that takes the longest to truly understand. Not that rocks exist, not that they contain fossils, not even that they record the past, all of which we learn in school and accept abstractly, but that the rock is the event. The limestone that forms in a warm Tethyan sea is not a record of that sea. It is the sea, compressed and lithified, turned to stone but still carrying in its chemistry and its texture and its structure every feature of the environment in which it formed. When you hold a piece of Triassic limestone in your hand, you are holding a Triassic sea. The ions that dissolved in that warm Tethyan water are there in the stone. The calcium carbonate that precipitated from solution in the bodies of organisms that have been dead for 200 million years is there. The sea is there. The rocks at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary hold a particularly intense record. This boundary, wherever it is found in the world, shows the same signature. A change in the carbon isotopes, a sudden and dramatic shift in the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13, that indicates a massive injection of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is the Camp eruption, recorded in chemistry, the volcanic event that ended one geological period and began another. Above and below this chemical signature, the fossils change. Below, Triassic animals and plants, the world we have been visiting tonight. Above, the beginning of the Jurassic fauna, fewer species initially, a world still reeling from the extinction, but with the dinosaurs in charge, the Pseudosuchians mostly gone, the mammals persisting, the pterosaurs still flying overhead. The transition was not instantaneous, of course. The Camp eruptions were episodic, with multiple pulses of volcanic activity spanning perhaps 600,000 years. Each pulse injected carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Each pulse warmed the world, acidified the oceans, disrupted the monsoon systems that terrestrial ecosystems depended on. The ecological response to each pulse unfolded over thousands of years of extinction and disruption, and the recovery between pulses was never complete before the next pulse began. What is it like to live through an extinction? That question is impossible to answer from inside, of course, because no individual organism lives long enough to perceive an extinction event as an event. An extinction is only an extinction from outside of it, from the perspective of deep time, from the vantage point of a future that can see what was lost. From inside, in the daily experience of the animals living through the end Triassic, there was only, today, this landscape, these conditions. A Coelophysis in the Rhaetian stage of the latest Triassic did not know it was living through the end of the Triassic. It was simply alive in its moment, doing what it always did. The volcanoes erupted in what is now the Central Atlantic Rift Zone, a region that was at the time entirely landlocked, part of the interior of Pangea, the zone where the continent was beginning to tear. The lava flows that characterized the camp eruptions were not the explosive, cone-building eruptions that we most commonly imagine when we think of volcanoes. They were flood basalt eruptions, where lava pours from fissures in the ground rather than from a central vent, spreading in sheets across the landscape. These flood basalt events are among the most geologically consequential events on the planet, not because of the lava itself, which is certainly destructive locally, but because of the gases. Millions of cubic kilometers of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide and other volatile compounds, vented over hundreds of thousands of years, overwhelming the atmosphere's capacity to absorb and buffer them. The sulfur dioxide in the short term created cooling. Volcanic aerosols in the stratosphere reflect sunlight back into space, lowering temperatures at the surface. The famous year without a summer following the 1815 eruption of Tambora in Indonesia, when temperatures globally dropped enough to cause widespread crop failures and famine, gives a small and brief glimpse of what volcanic cooling can do on human timescales. In the camp eruptions, the cooling from sulfur dioxide was probably intense but brief relative to the geological timescale, followed by the long-term warming driven by the carbon dioxide that persisted in the atmosphere for thousands of years after each pulse. The ping-pong between cooling and warming during the camp eruptions would have been devastating to ecosystems that had adapted to stable conditions. Plants that had evolved to thrive in the relatively warm conditions of the late Triassic found themselves suddenly in a cooling event, then suddenly in a warming event, then back to cooling as another pulse began. Animals dependent on stable plant communities found their food disappearing and reappearing in unpredictable cycles. The unpredictability itself was a killer, selecting strongly against specialization and toward generalism, toward the ability to eat many things and tolerate many conditions. This is why the dinosaurs survived. Not because they were superior in some absolute sense. Not because they were more intelligent or more powerful or more efficient. But because they were more generalist than most of what they competed with. Because the theropod body plan and the early sauropodomorph body plan were flexible enough to cope with dietary shifts when preferred food sources disappeared. Because the elevated metabolism of the dinosaur lineage allowed them to be active across a wider temperature range than typical reptiles. Because their relatively rapid reproduction allowed populations to recover from local die-offs more quickly than the larger, slower reproducing pseudosuchians. The survivors of the end Triassic walked into the Jurassic carrying exactly the toolkit they needed for what came next. And what came next was 200 million years of opportunity. There is something worth holding on to in that fact. The survivors did not know they were survivors. They did not know that the catastrophe they had just lived through was catastrophe. They simply continued, doing the next necessary thing, and in continuing they became the ancestors of everything that followed. The continuity is not something the survivors achieved. It is something that happened through them, through their persistence and their adaptability and the simple biological fact of staying alive long enough to reproduce. You are a continuation of that continuity. The same unbroken chain that runs from the first Triassic survivor of the Great dying through the entire 51 million years of the Triassic world and out the other side into the Jurassic and through the Mesozoic and into the world you inhabit runs through you, right now, in this moment, in the warmth of your body and the rhythm of your breathing and the extraordinary complexity of your brain processing the words of this story. Nothing in that chain was wasted. Nothing in that chain was pointless. Every extinction cleared space for something new. Every crisis produced survivors who were, in being survivors, exactly what the next chapter required. You are what the Triassic required. You are the continuation of the long patience of life, expressing itself in this moment in the form of a mammal in the dark, warm-blooded, breathing slowly on the edge of sleep. The rocks remember. And in some sense you do too. Not consciously, not in any way that can be put into language. But in your body, in the warmth and the rhythm and the extraordinary biochemistry that keeps you alive, the memory of the Triassic is there, encoded in every gene, in every cell, in every system that evolved in response to 250 million years of selection pressure. The Triassic remembered you before you existed. It shaped the conditions that made you possible. Rest in that. Let the boundary between the Triassic and the Jurassic be, for now, a soft place, a threshold you do not have to cross tonight, simply a marking in the rock that says, here something ended and something else began, and the thread of living continued. It always continues. You are safe in that continuity. Sleep is waiting just on the other side of this moment. Let yourself cross over. The rocks remember. That is the thing about geology that takes the longest to truly understand. Not that rocks exist, not that they contain fossils, not even that they record the past, all of which we learn in school and accept abstractly, but that the rock is the event. The limestone that forms in a warm Tethyan sea is not a record of that sea. It is the sea, compressed and lithified, turned to stone but still carrying in its chemistry and its texture and its structure every feature of the environment in which it formed. When you hold a piece of Triassic limestone in your hand, you are holding a Triassic sea. The ions that dissolved in that warm Tethyan water are there in the stone. The calcium carbonate that precipitated from solution in the bodies of organisms that have been dead for 200 million years is there. The sea is there. The rocks at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary hold a particularly intense record. This boundary, wherever it is found in the world, shows the same signature. A change in the carbon isotopes, a sudden and dramatic shift in the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13, that indicates a massive injection of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is the camp eruption, recorded in chemistry, the volcanic event that ended one geological period and began another. Above and below this chemical signature, the fossils change. Below, Triassic animals and plants, the world we have been visiting tonight. Above, the beginning of the Jurassic fauna, fewer species initially, a world still reeling from the extinction, but with the dinosaurs in charge, the pseudosuchians mostly gone, the mammals persisting, the pterosaurs still flying overhead. The transition was not instantaneous, of course. The camp eruptions were episodic, with multiple pulses of volcanic activity spanning perhaps 600,000 years. Each pulse injected carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Each pulse warmed the world, acidified the oceans, disrupted the monsoon systems that terrestrial ecosystems depended on. The ecological response to each pulse unfolded over thousands of years of extinction and disruption, and the recovery between pulses was never complete before the next pulse began. What is it like to live through an extinction? That question is impossible to answer from inside, of course, because no individual organism lives long enough to perceive an extinction event as an event. An extinction is only an extinction from outside of it, from the perspective of deep time, from the vantage point of a future that can see what was lost. From inside, in the daily experience of the animals living through the end Triassic, there was only, today, this landscape, these conditions. A coelophysis in the Rhaetian stage of the latest Triassic did not know it was living through the end of the Triassic. It was simply alive in its moment, doing what it always did. The volcanoes erupted in what is now the Central Atlantic Rift Zone, a region that was at the time entirely landlocked, part of the interior of Pangea, the zone where the continent was beginning to tear. The lava flows that characterized the camp eruptions were not the explosive, cone-building eruptions that we most commonly imagine when we think of volcanoes. They were flood basalt eruptions, where lava pours from fissures in the ground rather than from a central vent, spreading in sheets across the landscape. These flood basalt events are among the most geologically consequential events on the planet, not because of the lava itself, which is certainly destructive locally, but because of the gases. Millions of cubic kilometers of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide and other volatile compounds, vented over hundreds of thousands of years, overwhelming the atmosphere's capacity to absorb and buffer them. The sulfur dioxide in the short term created cooling. Volcanic aerosols in the stratosphere reflect sunlight back into space, lowering temperatures at the surface. The famous year without a summer following the 1815 eruption of Tambora in Indonesia, when temperatures globally dropped enough to cause widespread crop failures and famine, gives a small and brief glimpse of what volcanic cooling can do on human timescales. In the camp eruptions, the cooling from sulfur dioxide was probably intense but brief relative to the geological timescale, followed by the long-term warming driven by the carbon dioxide that persisted in the atmosphere for thousands of years after each pulse. The ping-pong between cooling and warming during the camp eruptions would have been devastating to ecosystems that had adapted to stable conditions. Plants that had evolved to thrive in the relatively warm conditions of the late Triassic found themselves suddenly in a cooling event, then suddenly in a warming event, then back to cooling as another pulse began. Animals dependent on stable plant communities found their food disappearing and reappearing in unpredictable cycles. The unpredictability itself was a killer, selecting strongly against specialization and toward generalism, toward the ability to eat many things and tolerate many conditions. This is why the dinosaurs survived. Not because they were superior in some absolute sense. Not because they were more intelligent or more powerful or more efficient. But because they were more generalist than most of what they competed with. Because the theropod body plan and the early sauropodomorph body plan were flexible enough to cope with dietary shifts when preferred food sources disappeared. Because the elevated metabolism of the dinosaur lineage allowed them to be active across a wider temperature range than typical reptiles. Because their relatively rapid reproduction allowed populations to recover from local die-offs more quickly than the larger, slower reproducing pseudosuchians. The survivors of the end Triassic walked into the Jurassic carrying exactly the toolkit they needed for what came next. And what came next was 200 million years of opportunity. There is something worth holding on to in that fact. The survivors did not know they were survivors. They did not know that the catastrophe they had just lived through was catastrophe. They simply continued, doing the next necessary thing, and in continuing they became the ancestors of everything that followed. The continuity is not something the survivors achieved. It is something that happened through them, through their persistence and their adaptability and the simple biological fact of staying alive long enough to reproduce. You are a continuation of that continuity. The same unbroken chain that runs from the first Triassic survivor of the Great dying through the entire 51 million years of the Triassic world and out the other side into the Jurassic and through the Mesozoic and into the world you inhabit runs through you, right now, in this moment, in the warmth of your body and the rhythm of your breathing and the extraordinary complexity of your brain processing the words of this story. Nothing in that chain was wasted. Nothing in that chain was pointless. Every extinction cleared space for something new. Every crisis produced survivors who were, in being survivors, exactly what the next chapter required. You are what the Triassic required. You are the continuation of the long patience of life, expressing itself in this moment in the form of a mammal in the dark, warm-blooded, breathing slowly on the edge of sleep. The rocks remember. And in some sense you do too. Not consciously, not in any way that can be put into language. But in your body, in the warmth and the rhythm and the extraordinary biochemistry that keeps you alive, the memory of the Triassic is there, encoded in every gene, in every cell, in every system that evolved in response to 250 million years of selection pressure. The Triassic remembered you before you existed. It shaped the conditions that made you possible. Rest in that. Let the boundary between the Triassic and the Jurassic be, for now, a soft place, a threshold you do not have to cross tonight, simply a marking in the rock that says, here something ended and something else began, and the thread of living continued. It always continues. You are safe in that continuity. Sleep is waiting just on the other side of this moment. Let yourself cross over. There is a particular quality of aftermath. The way a landscape looks after a storm has passed. The way a room feels after the last guest has gone. The way the body settles when it releases something it has been holding for too long. The Triassic ended in catastrophe, and the aftermath of that catastrophe was the Jurassic, and the Jurassic was the most extraordinary biological world this planet has ever produced. But we are not quite in the Jurassic yet. We are in the moment of crossing, in the threshold, in the geological equivalent of that exact moment between sleeping and waking when the boundaries are uncertain and what is real and what is dream are temporarily the same thing. This is where we will rest tonight. In the transition. In the space between one world and the next. The Triassic left a remarkable inheritance. 51 million years of rebuilding from the ashes of the Great Dying produced a world that was, in its final stages, close to the most biodiverse and ecologically complex that the planet had yet achieved since the Permian. The great conifer forests were established. The sauropodomorphs were large and widespread. The theropods were capable and varied. The early mammals were present and diversifying. The pterosaurs owned the sky. The ichthyosaurs and early plesiosaurs filled the seas. And then the camp erupted and much of it was lost again. But not all of it. And the things that survived were the things that mattered most, the lineages that carried within them the potential for the Jurassic world. The dinosaurs, the mammals, the pterosaurs, the crocodilians, whose ancestors had also navigated the end Triassic extinction successfully and would remain significant components of terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems throughout the Mesozoic. The turtles, which had first appeared in the Triassic and would outlast the dinosaurs entirely, persisting to the present day in forms that are recognizably similar to their Triassic ancestors. The lizards, which were beginning to diversify and would eventually produce the extraordinary diversity of modern squamates, from small gecko-like forms to the enormous monitor lizards of today to the snakes, which would evolve from lizard ancestors in the Cretaceous. The Triassic was a crucible. That word is used casually, but it has a specific meaning. A vessel in which materials are subjected to extreme heat and pressure for the purpose of purification or transformation. The Triassic subjected life to 51 million years of extreme conditions, beginning with the aftermath of the worst extinction in the history of complex organisms, continuing through the recovery, the reshaping, the new extinctions and new radiations, the shifting climate and fragmenting continent, and ending with another enormous extinction. And what emerged from that crucible was purified in the evolutionary sense. The things that could not adapt were gone. What remained was exactly what was needed. The sauropods that would dominate the Jurassic landscape were shaped by the Triassic. Their body plan, their physiology, their digestive adaptations for processing enormous quantities of plant material, these had all been established and refined through the late Triassic sauropodomorph radiation. The great Jurassic predators, the Allosaurs and Ceratosaurs, were the direct descendants of the Triassic theropods. The pterosaurs of the Jurassic, many of them dramatically larger than their Triassic ancestors, were the evolutionary products of the Triassic flying lineage that had first taken to the air in the Norian. And the mammals, the small, warm-blooded, insectivorous mammals of the earliest Jurassic, were the products of the entire Triassic cynodont evolutionary journey. 250 million years of gradual transformation from the mammal-like synapsids of the Permian through the increasingly mammalian cynodonts of the Triassic to the first true mammals at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. 250 million years of differentiated teeth and improving hearing and increasing metabolic rate and developing parental care and deepening nocturnality, all leading to the moment when the first truly mammalian animal, warm-blooded and insectivorous and small and nocturnal, emerged into a Jurassic world dominated by dinosaurs and found, against all odds, that it could survive there. More than survive. Persist. For 165 million years, through the entire age of the dinosaurs, the mammals persisted. They did not diversify into giants. They could not. The dinosaurs occupied the large animal niches too completely. But in the small animal niches, in the insectivore and omnivore niches, in the nocturnal niches, the mammals thrived. They diversified. They spread. They developed a variety of reproductive strategies, from egg-laying, which some primitive mammals retained throughout the Mesozoic and which the modern monotremes still use today, to increasingly elaborate live birth and parental care. And when the asteroid came 66 million years ago and the dinosaurs fell, the mammals were still there. 50 million years of living in the dinosaurs' shadows had not extinguished them. It had refined them, tested them, built in them the resilience and adaptability that would allow them to inherit the world that the dinosaurs left behind. That is the true gift of the Triassic. Not the dinosaurs, though the dinosaurs are magnificent and their story is one of the great ones. The true gift of the Triassic is the mammals. The true gift is the small, warm, persistent creatures that navigated 51 million years of crucible and came out the other side carrying everything needed to eventually become every mammal species that has ever lived, including the ones that would eventually look up at the night sky and wonder about it and tell stories about it and fall asleep listening to those stories. Including you. The Triassic made you. Not directly, not consciously, not in any way that the animals of the Triassic knew or intended. But the selection pressures of the Triassic, the competition for nocturnal niches and small animal ecological roles, the requirement to be metabolically efficient and reproductively flexible and cognitively capable enough to navigate a complex, changing world, these pressures shaped the lineage that produced the mammals, and the mammals produced everything that followed, including the primate order, including the hominid family, including the species Homo sapiens, including the individual lying in the dark right now, breathing slowly, letting the ancient world fill the space behind closed eyes. The Triassic is 252 to 201 million years ago. It is so far away in time that the numbers are essentially meaningless to the human brain, which evolved to count things it can see, to track time on the scale of days and seasons and years and lifetimes, not millions of years. But it is not far away in the sense that matters most. In the sense of inheritance, of connection, of the unbroken chain of living that extends backward from this moment through every moment before it, the Triassic is as close as your own heartbeat. The warm-blooded, fast-metabolizing, highly hearing small mammal that survived the late Triassic nights had a heart. It beat fast because small warm-blooded animals have fast hearts. 30, 40, 50 beats per minute at rest, more when afraid. It was warm. It was alive. And in that sense, in the sense that warmth and aliveness are the things that matter, in the sense that the thread of living is unbroken and direct from that animal to you, there is a continuity that no extinction can sever. You are the Triassic living. You are its gift to the future, continuing to be. That thought, if you let it in, is not frightening. It is not heavy with the weight of evolutionary obligation. It is simply true, and in being true it is also, in its own strange way, peaceful. You did not begin with your birth. You will not end with your death. The life that is in you is older than the Triassic and will be younger than whatever comes after us. You are a moment in it, as the Rawasuchian was a moment in it, as the sauropodomorph was a moment in it, as the first fish that ever breathed air was a moment in it. Be this moment now. That is all it asks. The Triassic world is settling around you. The red plains are cooling in the evening. The first stars are appearing above the conifer canopy. Somewhere, a small warm animal is pulling itself into a crevice in the rock, curling its body around itself, its eyes closing, its heartbeat slowing. It does not know where it is in the story of life. It only knows that it is tired and that the rock is warm and that for now it is safe. You are that animal in a very real sense. Not metaphorically. Literally. The living descendant 240 million years down the line, of that exact moment of safety and rest. Close your eyes. The Triassic night is long and warm. The stars do not move as fast as they seem to. The world turns slowly as it always has, carrying everything on it forward into time. Sleep well. The sauropods that would rule the Jurassic were, in the Triassic, still finding themselves. The prosauropods, those early relatives of the great long-necked giants, were the largest plant-eaters of their time, but they were not yet committed to the fully quadrupedal, fully enormous body plan of their Jurassic descendants. Plateosaurus, which we have met, could rise on its hind legs to reach higher vegetation. Massospondylus, from the late Triassic and early Jurassic of South Africa and Lesotho, was a slender, medium-sized prosauropod whose fossils include not only adult individuals but nesting sites and eggs and hatchlings, giving us an extraordinary window into the reproductive biology of these early dinosaurs. The Massospondylus nesting sites from the early Jurassic of South Africa are among the most important dinosaur fossil discoveries of recent decades. The site preserves multiple clutches of eggs, some containing embryos, along with a concentration of hatchlings that suggests communal nesting, the gathering of multiple individuals at the same site to lay their eggs. The hatchlings were approximately 15 centimeters long, tiny relative to the adults that would eventually reach 4 or 5 meters. Their limb proportions suggest they were not immediately capable of bipedal locomotion. They were quadrupeds at hatching, only gradually developing the limb proportions that would allow upright walking. This has implications for parental care. If hatchlings were incapable of immediately independent movement, they would have needed some degree of parental protection and possibly food provision in the early stages of life. Parental care in dinosaurs is a subject of ongoing research and genuine scientific excitement. The traditional image of dinosaurs as unfeeling, egg-abandoning reptiles has been substantially revised over the past several decades. Evidence from multiple dinosaur groups suggests that at least some species were attentive parents, perhaps brooding eggs in the manner of modern birds, certainly protecting nesting sites from predators, and in some cases potentially providing food for young. The famous brooding Oviraptorosaur specimens from the Cretaceous of Mongolia, where adult dinosaurs are preserved sitting on clutches of eggs in positions identical to those of modern brooding birds, are the most dramatic evidence of this, but earlier dinosaurs also show signs of parental investment. The implication is that the social lives of Triassic and early Jurassic dinosaurs were more complex than we might assume from their skeletal remains alone. They had behaviors. They had relationships, however non-mammalian, however structured by different cognitive and emotional capacities than ours. The sauropodomorph mother in the Massospondylus nesting colony was doing something that required her to return to a specific location, to recognize her own nest among others, to defend it from competitors and predators, to perhaps assess the condition of her eggs and the needs of her hatchlings. These are not trivial cognitive tasks. They require memory, spatial awareness, and something that functions at least behaviorally like care. The world of the early Jurassic, which the Triassic inheritance shaped and made possible, was also the world of the first birds. The protobirds, the feathered theropod dinosaurs that would eventually produce fully flighted species, were beginning their evolutionary journey in the Middle and Late Jurassic, but their roots were in the Triassic theropod radiation that produced Coelophysis and its relatives. The first bird, Archaeopteryx, famously preserved in the Jurassic limestones of Bavaria, was not a clean beginning but a continuation, a moment in a long process of transformation that had been underway since the earliest theropods developed the bipedal body plan, the hollow bones, the enlarged forearms, the respiratory air sacs, that would eventually support flight. Birds are dinosaurs. This is not a metaphor or an approximation. It is the taxonomic reality, established beyond reasonable scientific doubt by decades of phylogenetic analysis of skeletal features, confirmed by molecular biology, expressed in the everyday world by the fact that the birds outside your window are the living descendants of animals that survived the end Cretaceous extinction 66 million years ago. When you hear birdsong, you are hearing a dinosaur. When you watch a pigeon walk across a city square, you are watching an animal whose lineage extends back through the Jurassic and the Triassic and into the earliest dinosaurs of the Esquigualasto Formation. The Triassic gave us birds. It gave us crocodilians. It gave us turtles and lizards and the ancestors of snakes. It gave us the mammals from which all of us are descended. It shaped the conifer forests that still cover enormous areas of the northern hemisphere. It produced the pterosaurs, who filled the Mesozoic skies for 160 million years before they finally went extinct with the non-avian dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous. The legacy of the Triassic surrounds us. It is in every conifer forest, in every bird, in every crocodilian, in every mammal on Earth. It is in the molecular machinery of your own cells, machinery that was present and functioning in Triassic cynodonts and has been passed forward through every generation since. You are the Triassic still living. Rest now in that long inheritance. Let the ancient world settle around you like sediment settling in still water, layer by layer, very slowly, until everything is quiet and still and the water is clear. Sleep is already here. There is something worth sitting with as you rest in this moment, about the nature of inheritance itself. We speak of biological inheritance, of genes passed from parent to child in an unbroken chain stretching back to the first replicating molecule in some warm Precambrian pool. But there is also a kind of structural inheritance, an inheritance of form and relationship, that operates across longer timescales than any single gene. The arrangement of bones in your hand, that elegant articulation of radius and ulna and carpals and metacarpals and phalanges, traces back through the primate hand to the mammalian paw to the cynodont forelimb to the early tetrapod appendage that first hauled itself up a Devonian riverbank. Every modification, every refinement, was built upon what came before. Nothing was invented from nothing. The Triassic understood this in its way. It did not discard the innovations of the Permian and the Carboniferous. It kept them, modified them, redirected them. The warm blood and differentiated teeth of the cynodonts were not new in the Triassic. They were refinements of tendencies already present in the Permian, the rapids. The upright posture of the dinosaurs was an intensification of improvements already visible in earlier Archosaurs. Evolution works with what it has. It is never entirely free to start over, and that constraint, that deep continuity of form, is why the living world has the coherence it does, why a turtle still looks like a turtle and a bird still has five-fingered hands hidden inside its wings. You carry the same kind of continuity. Every skill you have learned, every habit, every way of moving through the world, was built on something that came before, some earlier capacity or experience that made the new thing possible. You did not invent yourself from nothing. You were assembled, carefully and over time, from everything you have encountered and everyone who has shaped you, going back and back through your own particular history to its own deep beginning. There is a kind of peace in recognizing that. You do not have to be new. You do not have to start over. You are already the accumulation of everything that has led to this moment, this breath, this quiet. The Triassic is in you. Let it hold you now. There is a particular kind of stillness that belongs to forests. Not the stillness of empty space, not the absence of sound or movement, but a more complex stillness, a stillness in which small sounds are always present but the scale of the trees and the depth of the light create a sense of peace that is independent of what is actually happening. Forests absorb. They muffle and soften. They replace the hard edges of the open landscape with something rounded and encompassing, something that feels, at some pre-verbal level, like being held. The Triassic had forests. Of course it did. And those forests, though they were different in their composition and structure from any forest you have ever walked through, had this same quality. This same sense of green enclosure. This same filtering of light and sound. Let us go into them. The dominant forests of the Triassic were conifer forests, as we have established. But saying conifer forest in the Triassic is like saying flowering plant forest in the modern world. Technically accurate but not terribly informative about the extraordinary diversity of form and structure that the term encompasses. The Triassic conifers were not the same conifers as the modern world. They were ancestral forms, some of them the direct ancestors of modern families, others belonging to lineages that would eventually go extinct, leaving no living representatives. But they had the fundamental conifer design, needle or scale-like leaves reducing water loss, resinous chemistry defending against fungal attack and herbivory, and seed cones allowing reproduction that was independent of the presence of water, unlike the spore-based reproduction of the ferns and horsetails that formed the forest understory. The forests of the Germanic Basin in the Middle Triassic were extensive. The climate here, influenced by the proximity of the Tethys Sea, was warm and seasonally humid, with wet summers and drier winters. The conifers that dominated these forests were large trees, some reaching 15 to 20 meters, their trunks straight and unbranched for much of their height, their canopies spreading out in the upper light. The forest floor was not densely vegetated in the way of a modern tropical rainforest. The light conditions were better here, filtered through a canopy that was present but not closed, and the understory was a mixed community of tree ferns, cycads, horsetails along the watercourses, and various small plants that have left fragmentary fossil records. The smell of this forest would have been resinous. strongly, intensely resinous. Modern conifer forests, especially in warm conditions, carry this smell, but the Triassic forests would have been more extreme. The warm climate would have volatilized the aromatic compounds in the resin more efficiently, creating an atmosphere thick with terpenes and pinene, the chemical language of conifers. Whether any Triassic animal experienced this smell as pleasant or neutral or aversive, we cannot know. But it was there, pervading every breath in the Triassic forest, a constant and defining feature of the environment. The amber that comes from Triassic resin deposits is among the most scientifically valuable material in paleontology. Amber is fossilized resin and it traps things. Small insects caught on the sticky surface of a resin flow are engulfed and preserved in 3 dimensions, their cellular structure intact, their physical details captured with a fidelity that no other preservation process matches. Triassic amber is rare compared to the Cretaceous amber of Myanmar and the Baltic amber of the Eocene, but it exists, and it preserves for us glimpses of the Triassic forest floor community that would otherwise be completely invisible. Mites, small insects, fragments of plant tissue. The occasional hair-like structure that might represent early integumental complexity. These tiny windows into the Triassic forest floor tell a story of a world in transition, of arthropod communities that are already recognizably modern in some respects while retaining archaic features that would disappear before the end of the Mesozoic. The forests of South America in the late Triassic were different from their European counterparts, reflecting the different climate of this region of Gondwana. The Esquigualasto Formation, which has produced such important dinosaur fossils, was deposited in a floodplain environment with rivers that carried substantial sediment load. The vegetation here was a mosaic of forest patches along the rivers, denser and more productive near water, giving way to more open scrub vegetation in the areas between watercourses. The Dichroidium seed ferns, those Gondwanan specialists, were present here, mixed with the increasingly dominant conifers. The whole community had a kind of transitional quality, the old Permian-derived plant communities being steadily replaced by the new Triassic flora even as the dinosaurs were being born among them. The forests of the high latitudes were different again. Antarctica, positioned much further north in the Triassic than today, experienced a temperate climate with strongly seasonal light, long days in summer and long nights in winter. The forests here were deciduous, or at least seasonally reduced in their photosynthetic activity, their growth rings interrupted by the dormant season in a way that reflects the changing light rather than temperature stress. These polar forests were slower growing and lower in diversity than their tropical counterparts, but they were forests nonetheless, covering the high latitudes in green, providing habitat for the animals that had spread to the margins of the continent. What lived in these forests? Many things we have already met. The early sauropodomorphs browsing in the canopy margins, their long necks extending into the middle story. The small theropods hunting at the forest edges, their keen eyes tracking the insects and small reptiles that moved through the leaf litter. The cynodonts in their burrows under the roots, their sensitive noses reading the air for the smell of predators, their whiskers detecting the vibrations in the ground that told them something heavy was nearby. But the forests themselves were also inhabited by creatures that rarely leave good fossils. Frogs, perhaps, or something very like frogs, had already appeared in the Triassic, their soft bodies leaving no record but their descendants appearing clearly in the Jurassic. Small, lizard-like lepidosauromorphs, the early relatives of the modern squamates, were certainly there, their scales and small bones occasionally preserved in fine-grained lake sediments. Early turtles, that remarkable group whose basic body plan has persisted almost unchanged for over 200 million years, were present by the late Triassic, their unique shell structure a mystery of evolutionary origin whose solution is still being actively investigated. The turtle shell is one of the strangest evolutionary innovations in vertebrate history. Modern turtles have a shell formed by the fusion of ribs with an outer layer of bone, creating a box that encloses the body completely. The ribs, which in virtually every other vertebrate animal are free to expand and contract with breathing, are locked in turtles, which means turtles had to evolve a completely different mechanism for ventilating their lungs. The transition to this body plan, the evolutionary steps that took a normal vertebrate with free ribs to an animal with fused, shell-forming ribs, has been one of the most puzzling questions in vertebrate paleontology. Fossils from the Triassic are beginning to answer this question. Odontocheles, from the Triassic of China, had a fully formed plastron, the bottom half of the shell but no upper shell, the carapace. This suggests the shell evolved in stages, the plastron coming first, perhaps as protection for an aquatic animal spending time on muddy substrates. Popocheles, from the Triassic of Germany, had broadened ribs that were on the way to forming a carapace but had not yet completed the fusion. The evolutionary sequence is becoming clearer, and it tells a story of gradual transformation over millions of years, of the basic vertebrate rib cage into one of the most unusual and successful protective structures in the history of life. The turtles in the Triassic forests were probably small, probably aquatic or semi-aquatic, probably unremarkable to any Triassic observer who happened to notice them. Nothing about them would have suggested that their lineage would outlast the dinosaurs, would survive multiple mass extinctions, would still be present in the modern world in over 300 species, persisting in the rivers and seas and forests of every continent except Antarctica. But they were there. And they survived. As turtles tend to do. The Triassic forest at night was a particular kind of world. The trees stood in darkness, their resinous smell perhaps even more concentrated in the cooled night air. The sounds were different from the day. The insects were different species, the nocturnal ones replacing the diurnal ones in a shift that happened at every dusk and reversed at every dawn. The cynodonts emerged. Their sensitive ears would have mapped the night with sound. The drip of condensation from leaves, the movement of small prey in the leaf litter, the distant sounds of a larger animal moving through the trees. And above everything, the sky. In the Triassic there was no light pollution. There was no artificial light of any kind anywhere. The night sky over a Triassic forest was dark in a way that almost no place on Earth is dark anymore. The Milky Way would have been extraordinary, a river of light across the darkness so bright that it cast faint shadows. Every star that was visible without instruments would have been visible, and the prehistoric sky was littered with more of them than most modern humans ever see. The cynodont in the forest did not look up at the stars and wonder about them. Its cognitive capacity was not organized around that kind of abstract contemplation. But it was aware of the light. Its evolved visual system was sensitive to low light levels, an adaptation to its nocturnal lifestyle, and the light of the Milky Way over the Triassic forest would have been enough to provide visual information. It navigated by that ancient light, as its descendants would navigate by it for 250 million more years. We are those descendants. We still look up at those stars or the same stars from a slightly different angle, and we still feel something when we do. Something that has no clean name in language but lives in the chest, a mixture of smallness and belonging, of being very far from home and somehow, at the same time, exactly where we are supposed to be. The Triassic forest is quiet now. The last light has gone from the sky. The trees stand in the dark and breathe their slow, patient, photosynthetic breath. The cynodont is still. The sauropodomorph is still. Everything is still. And you are still too, in the dark on the other side of 240 million years, as still as anything that has ever rested, as quiet as the Triassic night. Rest here. The taphonomy of Triassic forests tells us something about the trees themselves that their living form does not. Taphonomy is the study of how organisms become fossils, the processes of death and decay and burial and mineralization that turn living matter into rock. For trees, the most informative taphonomic environments are those where the tree is buried rapidly, before decay can destroy the wood structure, and then preserved under conditions that allow mineral replacement to proceed slowly and completely. The petrified forest of Arizona is the most famous example of fossil wood preservation in the world, and its trees are Triassic trees, the great Araucarioxylon arizonicum conifers that grew in the Chinle Formation 220 million years ago. The logs in the petrified forest are stunning to look at. The wood structure is preserved in silica in crystalline detail, the annual growth rings visible, the ray cells that transported nutrients laterally through the trunk preserved, even cellular details sometimes visible under magnification. These were not small trees. The largest preserved logs are over 50 meters long and more than 2 meters in diameter, implying trees of perhaps 60 to 70 meters when standing. 60 to 70 meters is taller than most modern skyscrapers above a few stories. These were the largest organisms in the Triassic world, the living architecture of the ecosystem, the shade providers and the habitat creators and the carbon stores. A tree 60 meters tall is not a background detail in an ecosystem. It is a structure that shapes everything around it. Its shade determines what can grow beneath it. Its root system determines the water table in its immediate vicinity. Its bark is habitat for insects and fungi and small vertebrates. Its upper canopy is habitat for pterosaurs or, in the Jurassic, for long-necked dinosaurs that can reach it. The Chinle forests were not uniformly dense. The preservation of the logs in growth positions, some still rooted or near their root systems, along with the general absence of the dense understory vegetation that would characterize a true closed canopy forest, suggests a more open woodland structure. Trees spaced with some distance between them, allowing light to reach the ground. River corridors with denser vegetation, transitioning to more open vegetation on higher ground. The patchwork landscape that would have been the home of Coelophysis and the other Chinese animals. The sound of the Chinese forest would have been primarily wind. Not the constant background sound of modern forests full of birds and insects and frogs, but something simpler. Wind in conifer needles has a particular sound, a sustained rustling sigh that is distinct from the sound of wind in broad leaves. It is a drier sound, more continuous, less punctuated by individual leaf impacts. On a windy day in the Chinese forest, the sound would have filled the landscape, surrounding every living thing in a constant gentle white noise of moving needles and swaying trunks. Insects contributed their own sounds. The cicada-like calls of ancient insects, if they had evolved singing by the late Triassic, which is uncertain. The wing beats of the larger flying insects, audible from some distance. The sawing and tunneling sounds of wood-boring beetles working in the large trunks. These were not silent forests, but they were quieter than any modern forest with its rich fauna of calling birds and frogs, and the quality of the sound was different, more mineral in a sense, more directly the sound of physical matter moving in air rather than the intentional communication of complex biological signaling. The freshwater bodies of the Triassic, the rivers and lakes and seasonal ponds, were as important to the life of the forest as the trees themselves. Water is always the organizer of terrestrial ecosystems, the element that determines where life concentrates and where it spreads more thinly. In the Triassic, with its extreme and variable climate, water was even more decisive. The rivers of the Chinle Formation and the Santa Maria Formation and the Cooper of Europe were not constant features. They were dynamic, seasonally flooding, seasonally shrinking, cutting new channels and abandoning old ones, depositing sediment and eroding it. The animals of these river systems, the fish and the early turtles and the phytosaurs and the small archosaurs and the occasional larger visitors from the forest, constituted communities of extraordinary ecological interest. The phytosaurs in particular were dominant freshwater predators, their long, narrow snouts and powerful tails making them effective hunters in the river environments they dominated. The convergence between phytosaurs and modern crocodilians is one of the most striking in the vertebrate fossil record, two entirely different lineages arriving at almost identical body plans in response to identical ecological challenges. The lesson of this convergence, and of the many other convergences visible in the Triassic, is that the solutions to ecological problems are constrained. There is only so much design space available for an efficient aquatic ambush predator. The solution space converges on the same forms again and again because the physics and the biology of the problem are the same. This is a kind of deep order underlying the apparent randomness of evolution, a set of attractors in morphological space toward which evolution repeatedly tends when faced with similar ecological challenges. You can feel this order in your own body. The way your eye is structured, the lens and the retina and the neural processing circuits that convert light into image, this is a solution that evolution arrived at independently in vertebrates and in octopuses and in other lineages. Your ear, the fluid-filled chambers and the hair cells that convert vibration into neural signal, this too is a deeply constrained solution to the problem of hearing, present in various forms across a wide range of animal lineages. Your very metabolism, the biochemical pathways that extract energy from food, these are ancient solutions, present in organisms that diverged billions of years ago, conserved because they work and because the cost of redesigning something that works is prohibitive. You are a collection of ancient solutions to ancient problems. Some of those solutions were developed in the Triassic. Some are older. Some came later. But all of them were arrived at through the same process of mutation and selection and the slow accumulation of effective innovations, the same process that shaped the phytosaur jaw and the conifer needle and the pterosaur wing and the differentiated teeth of the cynodont. The forest is quiet now. The wind in the needles is very low, almost a breath. The river is a distant murmur. The forest floor is soft with a thick layer of dead needles, resinous and dry, warm from the day's sun, beginning to cool as the night comes down. This is a good place to rest. Let the forest settle around you. Let the ancient air carry you. Let the deep past be, for now, simply the present. Sleep. Every act of flying contains within it a kind of astonishment. Watch a bird take off from a branch and there is a moment, a very brief moment, when what you are witnessing seems impossible. A body that was resting on solid matter launches itself into air and stays there, held up by nothing more substantial than the movement of wings. We have watched birds fly for all of our lives. We have seen it thousands of times. And still, if you pay attention, there is that moment of almost astonishment. Flight was invented 3 times by vertebrates. By the pterosaurs in the Triassic. By the birds in the Jurassic. And by the bats early in the Cenozoic. Each of these 3 inventions is independent. Each evolved the basic equipment of powered vertebrate flight from scratch from non-flying ancestors, by different routes through evolutionary space, arriving at similar solutions to the same physical problem. The wings of pterosaurs and birds and bats are analogous structures, similar in function, completely different in the evolutionary history that produced them. The pterosaurs invented flight first. That is a fact that deserves a moment of consideration. Long before the first bird, long before any feathered dinosaur had developed the proto-wings that would eventually lead to full flight, the pterosaurs were in the air. They were in the air in the Triassic, that early and alien world we have been exploring tonight. They were flying over the forests and the Tethys Sea and the red floodplains and the conifer-covered uplands, in bodies that had no feathers, in a world that had no flowers, in a sky that had never before seen anything larger than an insect sustain itself above the ground. The origin of pterosaur flight is one of the most contested questions in vertebrate paleontology. The fundamental question, trees down versus ground up, has dominated the debate about the evolution of flight in both pterosaurs and birds for decades. Did the ancestors of pterosaurs climb trees and glide from them, gradually developing powered flight from a gliding precursor? Or did they develop flight from the ground up, evolving flapping as a way to run faster or make more efficient escape jumps? Both hypotheses have proponents. Both have evidence in their favor. The truth may involve elements of both, or maybe something different entirely that the fossil record has not yet fully revealed. What is clear is that by the time we have fossil pterosaurs, in the Norian and Rhaetian stages of the late Triassic, they were already fully capable flyers. There are no transitional forms documenting the origin of pterosaur flight. The gap in the fossil record between ground-living Archosaurs and the first flying pterosaurs is complete. This is frustrating for paleontologists but not really surprising. The ancestors of pterosaurs were probably small, lived in environments where preservation was rare, and may have been a relatively short-lived transitional group whose evolutionary transformation from ground to air happened in a relatively small number of generations. Eudomorphodon, from the late Triassic of northern Italy, is one of the best-known early pterosaurs, and studying it gives you a sense of how remarkable these early flyers were. Its wingspan was approximately 1 meter, about the size of a large seagull. Its body was small and compact, its neck short and muscular, its long tail ending in a diamond-shaped flap of skin that functioned as a rudder. Its fourth finger, the elongated flight finger that supported the wing membrane, was dramatically longer than the other fingers, creating the characteristic pterosaur wing. But the most striking feature of Eudomorphodon was its teeth. They were complex, multi-cusped, differentiated in ways that suggest a sophisticated approach to food processing. The front teeth were long and peg-like, good for grabbing fish. The back teeth had multiple cusps, suggesting they were used for processing prey rather than simply gripping it. This dental complexity in a flying animal is unusual and tells us that Eudomorphodon was not simply catching and swallowing prey whole but was actually processing it in the mouth, extracting more nutritional value, which is consistent with the high metabolic demands of powered flight. Patenosaurus was another Triassic pterosaur from Italy, similar in size to Eudomorphodon but with a slightly different tooth structure and wing proportions that suggest a slightly different ecological role. It may have been more of an insect eater than a fish eater, its lighter build and possibly greater maneuverability making it better suited to the aerial pursuit of large flying insects. The Triassic sky was not empty before the pterosaurs. Insects had been flying for over 150 million years by the time the pterosaurs took to the air. Giant dragonfly relatives had patrolled Carboniferous skies with wingspans approaching 70 centimeters. Various other insects had developed flight independently. But no vertebrate had flown. No animal with a backbone, no animal of significant size relative to the insects, had achieved powered flight before the pterosaurs. Imagine the first time a large flying vertebrate appeared in the sky over a Triassic landscape. The insects, if they experienced it at all, must have found it alarming. A predator of unprecedented size and agility in their own aerial realm. The first pterosaur that skimmed the surface of a Tethyan lagoon and scooped up a fish was doing something no animal its size had ever done before. It was accessing a resource that had been available only to aquatic predators. It was operating in multiple elements simultaneously, capable of crossing the water from the land, of hunting below and above the surface with the same body. The pterosaurs would go on, in the Jurassic and Cretaceous, to become the most diverse flying vertebrates the world has seen. Their size range expanded enormously, from sparrow-sized insect eaters to the enormous Quetzalcoatlus of the late Cretaceous, whose wingspan reached 11 meters and whose estimated height when standing was as tall as a modern giraffe. The largest flying animal in the history of life. And that lineage, that entire extraordinary radiation, began with the small fish-catching flyers of the Triassic tethys. The pterosaurs navigated by sight and by whatever sensory systems they had developed for wind detection, pressure sensing, the reading of air currents. They would have experienced the world from above, a perspective that no other vertebrate had possessed. Looking down on the Triassic landscape from a pterosaur's altitude of 100 or 200 meters, you would see something very different from the view you get standing on the ground. The rivers would be visible as silver threads through the dark green of the forest. The lakes would gleam. The red rock of the exposed uplands would contrast with the vegetation of the lower slopes. The tethys, if you were flying over it, would be blue and shallow near the coasts, deepening to something darker offshore, stippled with the surface disturbance of the feeding fish that the pterosaur was there to catch. The coastline itself would be a kind of edge, a margin where two worlds met, where the productivity of the shallow sea combined with the accessibility of the land to create the kind of ecotone that always attracts life. From up here, from the pterosaur's vantage point, the world looks different. The problems of the ground, the predators, the competition for food and territory, the obstacles of dense vegetation and unstable terrain, all of these recede. From up here, only the broad patterns matter. The shape of the land, the direction of the wind, the glitter of water below, the smell of salt or fresh water, or the particular organic richness of a shoreline at low tide. This is a perspective worth taking with you into sleep. The elevation, the distance from the immediate, the sense of the broad pattern rather than the individual obstacle. The pterosaur banking on a thermal over the tethys, its great eyes taking in the entire lagoon at once, knowing where the fish are by the surface disturbance, adjusting its trajectory with a small tilt of the wing, beginning its long gliding descent toward the water. Nothing troubles it. The sky holds it. The wind carries it. Below, the ancient sea sparkles in the Triassic sun, and the fish move in their clouds through warm water, and the world is exactly what it is and nothing more. Take that elevation with you now. Rise a little. Let the details of the ground below you soften and become pattern. Let the broad shapes be enough. Let the wind carry you. The pterosaur knows how to rest in the air. It does not struggle to stay up. It tilts and adjusts and trusts the air beneath it, and the air holds it as it always has. Trust whatever is holding you now. It has been holding things much longer than you have been here to notice. The wind over the tethys in the Triassic was different from the wind over any modern ocean. Not in its basic nature, not in the physics of air moving across water, but in the world it moved through. No ships. No harbors. No lighthouses. No fishing nets. No human voices. Only the sound of wind on water, which is one of the oldest sounds on Earth, predating all life, predating even the ocean itself, the sound of atmosphere and hydrosphere interacting in the way they have always interacted, producing the patterns of surface waves and spray and foam that are so familiar and so ancient that they feel, when you encounter them, like something prior to experience itself. The pterosaur riding those Tethyan winds was, in some sense, the first animal to truly know the ocean from above. The first vertebrate to see the broad pattern of the sea from a sufficient altitude to appreciate its extent, to see the color changes that indicate depth, to see the surface disturbance that indicates fish near the surface, to see the curve of the coastline in both directions from a single vantage point. We cannot know what the pterosaur experienced. We cannot reach into its consciousness, however rudimentary that consciousness was by our standards, and describe what the view meant to it or whether it registered anything beyond the immediate practical information relevant to finding food. But the information was there. The view was there. Whatever capacity the pterosaur had for processing visual information about the world was processing that extraordinary view, that first vertebrate aerial perspective on the planet that would eventually produce animals capable of looking at it from orbit and feeling awe. The pterosaur lineage diversified throughout the Mesozoic in ways that parallel, and in some respects exceed, the diversification of modern birds. By the Cretaceous, pterosaurs had evolved forms as different from each other as a hummingbird is from an albatross, or a sparrow from a condor. The tiny anurognathids, no larger than a modern swift, swooped after insects with wide gaping mouths. The enormous asdarchids like Quetzalcoatlus stalked the Cretaceous plains on four limbs like enormous, otherworldly wading birds, their 11-meter wingspans folded close to their bodies as they hunted small vertebrates and carrion in the terrestrial environment. The pteranodonts of the western interior seaway soared over the shallow ocean with wingspans of 6 or 7 meters, catching fish by skimming the surface, their bony cranial crests functioning as rudders or display structures or both. None of this was inevitable at the beginning of the Triassic. None of it was planned. The pterosaurs of the Norian had no idea what they were beginning. They were simply flying, doing what their bodies had evolved to do, finding food, avoiding predators, reproducing. The diversification into all those extraordinary Mesozoic forms was the product of millions of years of accumulated evolutionary change, shaped by the environments those animals inhabited and the ecological opportunities those environments provided. Evolutionary diversification is always a retrospective description. From inside, there is only the immediate: the wind, the water below, the sense of hunger or satiety, the approach of a larger animal to be avoided or a smaller animal to be pursued. The broader pattern, the radiation into dozens of ecological roles, the occupation of every aerial niche from insectivore to megafaunal predator, this is visible only from outside, from the vantage point of the deep future that can hold the entire history in its view. You have that vantage point. You are the deep future looking back. And from that vantage point, the trajectory of the pterosaurs is beautiful. From the first small fish-catching flyers of the Triassic to the enormous Cretaceous soaring machines, 160 million years of flight, the same lineage continuously refining and elaborating and specializing, filling the sky with forms that no other group had ever produced, right up to the end Cretaceous extinction that ended their lineage at last, leaving the air to the birds that had been quietly diversifying in their shadow for 80 million years. The pterosaurs are gone. But the birds are here. And the sky, the same sky that the Eudomorphodon banked in over the Triassic tethys, is still full of wings. Let that thought carry you. The wings and the wind and the ancient sky, still there above you right now, outside wherever you are sleeping, the same air that the pterosaurs flew through, older than the Triassic, older than life, moving over the surface of the world in its patient, constant patterns. The sky holds everything. It always has. Rest beneath it now. Something is moving in the undergrowth. It is very small. If you were standing in a Triassic forest on a late Retian afternoon, in the last few million years of the Triassic period, and something near the base of a large conifer caught your eye and you looked down, you would see it for only a moment before it was gone. A small, furred shape. Quick. Low to the ground. Gone into the shadows before your eye could properly focus on it. That was your ancestor. The first true mammals appeared at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, or perhaps in the very latest Triassic, depending on how you define the term mammal. The definition itself is a matter of evolutionary semantics. Mammals are defined by a constellation of traits: the lower jaw composed of a single bone, the dentary, a middle ear containing 3 bones, the malleus, incus and stapes, differentiated teeth including incisors, canines and molars, endothermy, the maintenance of a constant internal body temperature, live birth in most lineages, though egg-laying persists in monotremes, and lactation, the production of milk for nourishing young. No single one of these traits defines a mammal. All of them together do. And the cynodonts, those long-suffering survivors of the Triassic, had been accumulating these traits for 50 million years. By the late Triassic, the most derived cynodonts had nearly all of them. The jaw was predominantly dentary, with the post-dentary bones reduced to tiny slivers of bone attached to the back of the lower jaw. The ear was sensitive and sophisticated, hearing in a higher frequency range than their ancestors, able to detect the high-frequency sounds that small nocturnal prey animals make. The teeth were differentiated, capable of chewing rather than just biting. The metabolism was elevated, the growth rates fast. When the first true mammals crossed the taxonomic boundary, they crossed it not in a single moment of transformation but in the way that all evolutionary transitions happen. Gradually, imperceptibly, with no individual animal knowing that it had crossed anything. The first mammal was the offspring of something that was not quite a mammal. His children were mammals too. And their children. And it went on like that, generation by generation, the accumulated changes of millions of years of cynodont evolution finally crystallizing into something that we would, looking at its fossils today, call a mammal. Morganeucodon is often cited as one of the earliest known true mammals. It is known from late Triassic and earliest Jurassic deposits of whales in China, a fact that is itself remarkable, that the same small animal, or at least the same species, was present on opposite sides of the Triassic world, tells us something about how quickly and widely this new kind of animal spread. Morganeucodon was very small, about the size of a modern shrew or small mouse, perhaps 15 to 20 grams. It had a long pointed snout packed with small sharp teeth. Its eyes were large relative to its head, an adaptation to low light or nocturnal conditions. Its brain, while small by mammalian standards, was already larger relative to body size than that of its cynodont ancestors. That last point is significant. Mammalian brains, even very early mammalian brains, are distinguished by having proportionally large neocortex regions, the part of the brain associated with sensory processing, motor control, and in its later, more elaborate forms, complex cognition. The expansion of the mammalian neocortex is one of the most important developments in the history of vertebrate neurology, and it began in the Triassic, driven by the demands of a nocturnal lifestyle that required processing complex multisensory information in real time. Think about what it means to be a small, warm-blooded animal navigating at night. You cannot see well. The visual information that guides most diurnal animals through their world is largely absent. You have to build your map of the world from other senses. Smell, hearing, touch through your whiskers, perhaps a sense of the magnetic field, perhaps sensitivity to vibrations through the ground. The brain has to integrate all of this information quickly and accurately. A mistake, a misidentification of a large shape in the dark, a failure to hear the approach of a predator can be fatal. There is strong selective pressure for better information processing. And better information processing means a bigger, more complex brain. The Triassic mammals were at the beginning of this process, the initial stages of the brain expansion that would eventually, over 250 million years, produce the human brain. Their brains were not large by our standards. They could not think abstractly, could not plan beyond the immediate, could not conceive of time on any scale beyond the seasonal cycle they experienced. But they were processing their sensory world with more sophistication than any vertebrate before them. Morganukadon and its contemporaries, animals like Haramyavia from Greenland and Eosostrodon from Britain, were not alone in the late Triassic small animal world. They coexisted with a variety of other small vertebrates, early lizard-like lepidosauromorphs, small crocodiliform archosaurs that had not yet committed fully to the aquatic lifestyle their descendants would adopt, young individuals of the larger dinosaur species, and various other small reptiles whose phylogenetic positions are still being worked out. The small animal community of the late Triassic was actually relatively diverse, evidence that the ecological niches below a certain body size were being filled even while the large animal community was still sorting itself out. What did Morganukadon eat? The teeth tell us. Small insects primarily and perhaps small arthropods generally, the kinds of prey that could be caught and processed by the sharp, interlocking teeth that are characteristic of insectivorous mammals. The Triassic insect fauna was rich and diverse by the late part of the period, and a small, agile, warm-blooded animal capable of moving quickly in three-dimensional space through complex vegetation would have been an effective hunter of insects and their larvae. The reproductive biology of the earliest mammals is reconstructed by analogy with the most primitive living mammals, the monotremes. Modern monotremes, the platypus and the echidnas of Australia and New Guinea, lay eggs. The eggs are small with a leathery shell, not the hard-shelled eggs of birds and most other reptiles. After hatching, the young are nourished by milk that seeps through pores in the mother's skin, since monotremes do not have nipples. This bizarre reproductive strategy is considered primitive, a retention of ancestral mammalian traits, and the earliest mammals probably reproduced in a similar way. The image of the first mammals, egg-laying, milk-secreting, insect-eating, nocturnal small animals in the undergrowth of a dinosaur-dominated world, has a kind of poignancy to it. These were not impressive animals by any obvious measure. They were not the largest, the fastest, the most powerful, the most intelligent by any conventional measure. They were the most persistent, the most adaptable, the most invisible in a world where visibility was often fatal. Persistence is an underrated virtue in the history of life. It is not as dramatic as the sudden rise of a new dominant group, not as striking as the rapid radiation of an innovative design into dozens of ecological roles. Persistence is quiet. It does not make for vivid fossil assemblages or dramatic ecological transitions. It is simply being there, generation after generation, surviving what needs to be survived, adapting to what needs to be adapted to, never quite disappearing. The mammals persisted through the Triassic. They persisted through the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. They persisted through the end Cretaceous extinction that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. And then, when the world was empty of its great reptilian rulers, persistence became opportunity, and the mammals diversified into everything. The warm blood that kept Morganukadon active on a Triassic night is still active in you. The sensitive ear that detected predators in the dark of the Triassic forest is still detecting the sounds around you, the ambient sounds of wherever you are lying right now. The brain that integrated all of those nocturnal sensory signals into a coherent map of a dangerous world has grown and elaborated and become something that can contemplate the Triassic, can imagine Morganukadon in the dark, can understand, in however partial and imperfect a way, the extraordinary story of which both Morganukadon and you are part. Let the warmth of your own metabolism be, for a moment, a connection to all the warm-blooded animals that came before you. Let your own heartbeat be an echo of Morganukadon's fast, small heart, beating in the dark of a Triassic night 210 million years ago. The rhythm is different, the rate is different, the body that beats it is enormously different. But the warmth is the same warmth. The darkness is the same darkness. The need to rest, to restore, to let the activity of the day give way to the deep processing of sleep, that is the same need. You are a mammal in the dark. You have always been a mammal in the dark. The Triassic knew you, in its own way, in the shape of the small ancestor that carried you forward through time. Close your eyes. Morganukadon is in its nest. Its eggs are warm. Its small body is warm. The forest is dark and the insects are calling and the world is very, very large and very, very old, and it does not need anything from you right now except that you rest. Rest then. The dental record of the early mammals is one of the richest sources of information we have about their lives and their evolutionary history. Teeth are remarkably durable. They are made of the hardest biological material, hydroxyapatite, a form of calcium phosphate that resists decay far better than bone, that survives geological processes that would destroy soft tissue and even most bone. Teeth persist. And because teeth are so specific to diet and ecological role, the teeth of early mammals tell us an enormous amount about how they lived. Morganukadon's teeth, those small, sharp, interlocking structures in a lower jaw that was almost entirely dentary bone, are the teeth of an insectivore. The pattern of cusp and basin on the molars, the way the upper and lower teeth fit together in a precise, repeatable occlusion, is characteristic of an animal that needed to crack and process hard-bodied invertebrates. The chitinous exoskeletons of Triassic insects were not trivially easy to digest. They needed to be crushed and at least partially broken down before the nutritious soft contents could be accessed. The Morganukadon molar was a machine for doing exactly this, honed by millions of years of cynodont evolution into an efficient tool for processing arthropod prey. The precision of mammalian tooth occlusion, the way upper and lower teeth fit together with remarkable accuracy, is one of the defining features of the group and one of the reasons mammalian teeth are so distinctive in the fossil record. Most reptile teeth are simple and interchangeable, designed for catching and holding prey rather than for the complex food processing that mammals do. Mammalian teeth are designed, through the precision of occlusion, to work as a system, upper and lower teeth cooperating to shear and crush food in a way that is far more efficient than simple puncturing. This precision required a new developmental mechanism. To have precisely occluding upper and lower teeth, you need a mechanism that ensures the upper teeth erupt in exactly the right positions relative to the lower teeth generation after generation. Modern mammals achieve this partly through a single set of replacement teeth, the deciduous teeth replaced by the permanent teeth in a precisely timed sequence, after which no further tooth replacement occurs. The relationship between upper and lower teeth is thus fixed for life. This is very different from the multiple tooth replacement cycles of most reptiles, which continuously replace worn or lost teeth throughout their lives. The early mammals were developing this system. The evidence from Morganukadon and its contemporaries suggests they were at an intermediate stage, replacing teeth multiple times in early life but with a more limited replacement capacity than typical reptiles. The full mammalian one replacement system was still being evolved. But the direction of change was clear, and the selective pressure driving it was the premium on tooth occlusal precision in animals whose feeding efficiency depended directly on the accuracy of tooth-to-tooth contact. All of this dental evolution was happening in the dark. Literally in the dark. The nocturnal habit of the early mammals, their retreat to the night when the diurnal dinosaurs and other large reptiles were less active, was driving evolutionary change in multiple systems simultaneously. The ears were improving to detect high-frequency sounds, because high frequencies carry more directional information and because small animals like insects produce high-frequency sounds. The eyes were adapting to low light, increasing in size and sensitivity, developing the cellular machinery for enhanced twilight and night vision. The brain was expanding to integrate the complex multimodal sensory world of the night. And the teeth were improving to process the best food available at night: insects. The Triassic nights were full of insects. Flying insects, crawling insects, insects in the leaf litter and on bark and in the soil and in the water. A small, warm-blooded, agile animal that could catch and process insects efficiently had access to an enormous food resource that was largely unexploited by other vertebrates at the same body scale. The early mammals were the first vertebrates to fully exploit the nocturnal insect resource at small body sizes, and the teeth that allowed them to do so efficiently were a key part of their success. The small mammal in the undergrowth of the late Triassic was not thinking about its teeth. It was not thinking at all in the way that we use the word thinking. It was responding to its sensory world with a brain that was increasingly sophisticated but still far from the kind of self-reflective consciousness that asks questions about its own existence. It was simply alive. Hunting. Hiding. Eating. Sleeping. Breeding. doing the next necessary thing. But the complexity that would eventually produce self-reflective consciousness was being built, tooth by tooth and gene by gene, in the dark of the Triassic night. Every generation that passed added something. Every challenge met and survived refined something. Every small advantage accumulated, and the accumulation never stopped. You are the accumulation. 250 million years of addition, of refinement, of increasing complexity and capability. You are what all of that patient nocturnal work was building toward. And right now, the most important thing you can do with all of that extraordinary accumulated complexity is sleep. Because that is what the accumulation requires. That is what the biology asks for. That is what Morganukadon and every mammal before you and after it has done when the work of the day is done and the dark is safe. Sleep. The Triassic night holds you. There is a phrase in geology, deep time, that refers to the scale of time in which geological and evolutionary processes operate. Deep time is time measured in millions and billions of years rather than in the human scales of minutes and hours and years and generations. It is time so vast that the human brain, which evolved to track seasons and lifetimes and historical memory spanning a few thousand years at most, cannot truly comprehend it. We can represent it. We can write the numbers. We can make analogies, compress the history of the Earth into a single year and point to where the dinosaurs appear on December 26th, or put a kilometer of walking into timescale terms. But truly feeling the depth of deep time is probably beyond the capacity of any nervous system that evolved on the timescale it did. And yet, deep time is the medium in which we exist. We are not separate from geological time. We are expressions of it. Our bodies are made of atoms that have been in the cosmos for 13.5 billion years, in the Earth for 4.5 billion years, cycling through rock and ocean and atmosphere and living tissue in patterns that operate on exactly the scales of deep time. The calcium in your bones was once in a Triassic sea. The iron in your blood was forged in a star that died before the Earth existed. You are, in the most literal possible sense, a product of deep time. You are what 4.5 billion years of planetary chemistry and 3.5 billion years of evolution have been building toward this moment. The Triassic was 51 million years long. In that 51 million years, life rebuilt itself from almost nothing, diversified into extraordinary new forms, developed the fundamental body plans and physiological innovations that would define the Mesozoic era, and then was partially dismantled by volcanic catastrophe at the end. All of this happened in 51 million years. Human civilization, by contrast, has lasted approximately 10 to 12,000 years. Recorded history is perhaps 5,000 years old. The interval between the birth of the first human being who would be recognizable as fully modern in their cognition and behavior and the present day is approximately 300,000 years. 1.3% of the duration of the Triassic. Less than the time it takes for a major mountain range to rise or a significant ocean basin to open. This is not said to diminish human experience or human achievement. Everything that has ever happened to a human being, every joy and sorrow and love and loss, every thought and creation and act of kindness or cruelty, is real and matters in the way that real things matter. The scale of deep time does not make those experiences smaller. It makes them more remarkable. The fact that consciousness and experience and meaning emerged from this enormous geological process, that the universe produced something capable of comprehending the universe, this is perhaps the most extraordinary thing that has happened in the 4.5 billion years since the Earth formed. But deep time has something to teach about patience. About the relationship between what is happening right now and what the overall arc of things looks like from a distance. When you are inside a moment of crisis, when the immediate problems press in with their urgency and their apparent permanence, it can be useful to remember the Triassic. The Triassic was 51 million years of crisis, more or less continuously. The Great Dying, the Recovery, the Carnian Pluvial Episode, the End Triassic Extinctions. Crisis after crisis after crisis. And yet, from outside it, from the perspective of the time that came after, what you see is not the crises. What you see is what survived them, what built on them, what used them as the raw material for something extraordinary. The dinosaurs of the Jurassic could not have existed without the crises of the Triassic. The mammals of the Cenozoic could not have existed without the crises of the Triassic and the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. You could not exist without all of it. Every crisis, every extinction, every catastrophe, every moment of apparent failure in the history of life was also a clearing, a reorganization, a making of space for something new. This is not a prescription for passivity in the face of difficulty. The living things of the Triassic did not survive their crises by remaining passive. They survived by exactly the opposite of passivity, by responding, by adapting, by finding the available niche and filling it, by doing the next thing that needed to be done. Morganukadon in the undergrowth was not patient in the way of someone choosing patience. It was active, alert, responding to the immediate demands of its world. But from our perspective, 210 million years later, that activity looks like patience. It looks like an endurance so vast and so persistent that patience is the only word that fits. You have that endurance in you. It is part of what you inherited from Morganukadon and every warm-blooded creature before and after it. The capacity to keep going. Not with grand narrative certainty, not with the knowledge that things will improve or that suffering will be redeemed or that the arc is bending towards something you want. Simply the capacity to keep going because that is what living things do, because that is what the whole history of life on Earth demonstrates, moment by moment and generation by generation, in the only language evolution knows how to speak. The patience of the Earth is not a quality the Earth consciously possesses. The Earth does not feel patient. It does not wait. It simply is, at any given moment, exactly what it is, and the next moment it is slightly different, and the differences accumulate and 51 million years pass, and it is the Triassic, and then it is not the Triassic and something else has begun. In any moment of any night, somewhere on the Earth, something is moving through darkness that it has lived in for so long that the darkness is not frightening but simply familiar. The deep-sea fish that never knows light. The cave cricket that navigates by touch and sound. The owl that hunts by the faint overhead luminescence of the overcast sky. All of them moving through a darkness that is simply their world, not threatening, not hostile, simply the medium in which they are alive. You are like them in this moment. Moving through the darkness of sleep toward the rest that your body needs, navigating by the compass of your own biology, which knows far better than your conscious mind what rest is and how to reach it. Your body has been doing this for 300,000 years as a modern human, for several million years as a hominid, for 66 million years as a placental mammal, for 210 million years as a mammal of any kind. Your body knows how to sleep. Trust it. Let it do what it has always done. The Triassic is over. It was 51 million years and then it was done, and the Jurassic began, and the Jurassic was 56 million years and then it was done too. Every age ends. Every night ends. The particular darkness you are in right now will lighten. It always does. That is not a promise from any person or any power. It is just the nature of the planet turning, which it has done without interruption for 4.5 billion years, and shows no sign of stopping. The Triassic passes behind you now, the way the lights of a town pass the window of a train at night. You saw it or some part of it. The red plains and the shallow seas and the conifer forests and the strange creatures moving through them. The first dinosaurs small and quick. The first pterosaurs banking on the Tethyan winds. The first mammals warm and nocturnal, their large eyes reading the dark. All of it passing as everything passes. What remains is now. What remains is you, in the dark, warm-blooded, breathing, the extraordinary product of 51 million Triassic years and everything before and after them, resting in this moment which is all there has ever really been. Sleep is very close. You are already most of the way there. Let the last edge of waking dissolve. Let the Triassic recede into the deep past where it lives. Let the present moment become as soft and undifferentiated as the late Triassic night. Sleep. The science of sleep itself is one of the most remarkable subjects in modern biology, and it has a connection to the Triassic that is more direct than you might expect. The basic architecture of sleep, the division of sleep into stages, the cycling between deeper and lighter sleep across the night, the consolidation of memory during sleep, the regulation of sleep by the body's internal circadian clock, all of these features of sleep are mammalian features. They are part of the mammalian heritage, part of the extraordinary physiological package that the cynodonts of the Triassic were developing and that the first true mammals refined into the system you are using right now. Reptiles sleep, in the sense that they have periods of reduced activity and altered brain state. But reptile sleep is simpler than mammalian sleep. It lacks the complex staging, the elaborate cycling, the intense memory consolidation phases that characterize mammalian sleep. The mammalian sleep system seems to be, in part, a product of the demands of a complex, high-metabolism, information-rich lifestyle. When you are a small, warm-blooded, nocturnal animal navigating a complex world through multiple senses simultaneously, when you are accumulating large amounts of sensory information and building complex spatial maps and tracking the identities and behaviors of multiple other individuals, you need a sophisticated system for processing and consolidating all of that information. Sleep appears to be that system. The expansion of the mammalian brain that began in the Triassic cynodonts was, in part, an expansion driven by the demands of complex information processing. And the sleep system that evolved alongside that expanded brain was, in part, an expanded system for processing the increased volume of information that the larger brain could accumulate during waking hours. Your REM sleep, with its characteristic dreaming and its intense neural activity, is the direct descendant of a system that was being developed in Triassic cynodont brains to process the complex sensory experiences of a nocturnal life in a dangerous world. When you dream tonight, if you dream, you will be doing something that Morganeucodon also did, in its burrow in the Triassic forest 210 million years ago. The content of the dreams will be entirely different. The processing will be more elaborate. But the fundamental process, the reactivation and consolidation of the day's experiences in the absence of new sensory input, the cycling of brain activity through deep and light stages, the gradual reconstruction and filing of memories, this is the same process. It was present in the first mammals. It is present in you. Rest in that continuity. The biology of rest itself connects you to the Triassic, to the small warm ancestors who first needed it the way you need it now. The brain consolidates its work in the dark. The body repairs itself in the quiet. Everything that needs to happen while you are not directing it is happening now, in the darkness, with the patient efficiency of systems that have been doing this for 200 million years and know, without any instruction or intention, exactly what to do. You do not need to think about breathing. Your body breathes. You do not need to think about your heart. It beats. You do not need to think about sleeping. If you let it, sleep will come as it has come for every mammal that has ever lived, as it comes every night in every warm-blooded body on the planet, as it came for the first cynodont that ever let its guard down in the dark and found that rest was waiting. Rest is always waiting. It was waiting for Morganeucodon. It was waiting for every one of your ancestors in the unbroken line from that Triassic forest to this moment. It is waiting for you. Let the last thoughts dissolve. Let the images of the Triassic world, the red plains and the shallow seas and the conifer forests and the small warm animals in their burrows, let them become less specific, less detailed, more like the feeling of a world than the description of one. Let them become the sense of ancient time, of vast unhurried processes, of the planet breathing. Breathe with it. The Triassic night is very long. It lasted 51 million years. You only need to sleep through one night of it. And it is already happening. Time in the Triassic was not experienced by anything alive in the way that we experience it. Nothing knew how old the world was. Nothing felt the weight of the 50 million years that stretched between the early Triassic disaster and the world of the Nourian. Each creature, each plant, each organism in the sea lived entirely in its present moment, bounded by its own short life and the immediate pressures of hunger and safety and reproduction. The accumulated architecture of all that time was invisible to its inhabitants. Only we, looking back across the immensity of deep time, can see the shape of it. Only we can trace the thread that runs from the small burrowing survivors of the Permian extinction to the sauropodomorphs raising their long necks in the Nourian clearing. This is one of the extraordinary things about being human. We can know deep time. We can hold it, imperfectly but genuinely, in our minds. We can feel the weight of 250 million years even though we live for less than a century. We can mourn creatures that died before our ancestors existed. We can feel wonder at a world we will never see and that would have killed us instantly if we had somehow been dropped into it. This capacity for reaching beyond our own moment, for caring about what happened before us and what will happen after, is one of the things that makes us strange and remarkable animals. The Triassic world is there, always, in the rock beneath every landscape on Earth, in the fossilized bone and shell and leaf that preserves its memory for anyone patient enough to look. It does not go away. The past is, in a deep sense, permanent. Everything that happened in the Triassic still happened. The sauropodomorph still raised its head in that Nourian clearing, even though the moment is gone. The ichthyosaur still moved through that warm tethys water. These things are as real as anything you have ever known. They are simply far away in time. Let that distance comfort you rather than trouble you. The world is very large and very old, and you are held in it as you have always been, as everything has always been held. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. The story is done now. Or the story is never done because it is still going because you are still in it, but the telling of it is complete for tonight. Somewhere in the deep past, the Triassic world is exactly as it always was. The conifer forests are standing in the warm air. The pterosaurs are sleeping on their rocky perches, their wing membranes folded, their heads tucked, their bodies warm. The cynodont is in its burrow, its small heart beating slow. The sauropodomorph is still in its clearing, its enormous body settled into the ground, breathing. The ocean is breathing too, its surface rising and falling in the long rhythm of open water, the ichthyosaur far below moving through darkness too deep for light. Everything that has ever rested is resting now. Everything that has ever been still is still. You are part of this. You are made of the same carbon, the same atoms, the same ancient matter that made all of it. You are the Triassic continuing forward through time into this dark, quiet moment. You are exactly where you are supposed to be, which is here, which is resting, which is breathing, which is letting the world carry on without your participation for a few hours while your body and brain do what they have always done when darkness comes and movement stops. Rest. You are held. Sleep. You are safe. The world will be exactly where you left it when you wake. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. Good night.